After my son-in-law's fraud destroyed my company and reputation, I ended up working as a waiter at 73 years old. One morning, this wealthy white businessman walked into the diner talking loud on his phone about some big deal. He spread his financial papers all over the table like he owned the place. When I asked him to keep it down, he looked at me like I was nobody and said, "Do you understand this call is worth more than you'll make in your entire lifetime?" The whole diner went quiet. I glanced down at his papers. Financial statements, merger documents, leverage ratios that made my stomach turn. I'd seen these patterns before, too many times. "Actually, sir," I said, "I understand that you're about to lose everything you think you own. Those leverage ratios look dangerous. Your cash flow structure appears unstable. Based on what I can see here, you'll be bankrupt in 6 months." He stared at me like I'd lost my mind. "Financial advice from a waiter," he laughed. "What exactly qualifies you to make such bold predictions about my business?" "Experience," I said. 30 years managing portfolios before my son-in-law destroyed my company. I've seen more financial disasters than you've had board meetings, and yours has all the classic warning signs." His face went pale. He grabbed his papers and stormed out without paying. I figured that was the end of it. But the next morning at 6 a.m., sharp, someone knocked on the diner door before we opened. I looked through the glass, and there he stood in the rain designer suit, wrinkled, looking like he hadn't slept all night, clutching a folder against his chest. Before I continue this story, hit subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. Let me take you back to how this all started. 2 years ago, I was Walter Davis, senior partner at Davis & Partners Financial Consulting. I had a corner office in downtown Chicago with a view of Lake Michigan that people paid good money just to photograph. My desk was mahogany, my chairs were leather, and my reputation was bulletproof. Or so I thought. I managed portfolios worth over $50 million. My clients included tech entrepreneurs who'd made their fortunes in Silicon Valley, real estate moguls who owned half of Chicago's skyline, and old money families whose wealth went back 4 generations. They trusted me with their children's college funds, their retirement accounts, their legacies, and I delivered. Year after year, I delivered returns that made other financial advisors jealous. I'd built that company from nothing. Started in 1982 with one client, an old friend from my college days who believed in me when banks wouldn't give a young black man a business loan. 40 years of grinding, networking, proving myself twice as hard to get half the recognition. By 2022, Davis & Partners was one of the most respected minority-owned financial consulting firms in Illinois. I drove a Mercedes, lived in a 3-bedroom condo in Lincoln Park, and had enough in savings to retire comfortably at 70. My daughter Diane was a nurse with 2 beautiful kids. Life was good, better than good. I'd beaten the odds, broken through ceilings, built something substantial. I used to joke with my colleagues that I'd work until I was 80 because I loved what I did too much to stop. That confidence, that pride, that belief that I'd finally made it, made what came next hurt even worse. Because when you've spent your whole life building something, when you've sacrificed and fought and earned every single thing you have, losing it all doesn't just break you financially, it breaks something deeper. It makes you question everything you thought you knew about the world, about people, about your own judgment. And that's exactly what my son-in-law Brandon did to me. The FBI raid happened on a Tuesday morning in October. I was reviewing quarterly reports, sipping my second coffee of the day, when federal agents in Navy windbreakers stormed through our glass doors like they were raiding a drug cartel. They had a warrant, they had seizure notices, and they had one name at the center of their investigation: Brandon Mitchell, my former son-in-law. Brandon was white, 35 years old, and had been married to my daughter Diane for 8 years before they divorced. The divorce was finalized just 14 months before the fraud investigation began. But during the marriage, I'd made him a junior partner, given him access to client accounts, trusted him with sensitive financial information. He was family. Or he had been. For 8 months, Brandon had been forging my signature on transfer documents, moving money between accounts like he was playing some sick game with people's life savings. $2.7 million, gone. Moved through shell companies' offshore accounts, places that would take federal investigators months to untangle. The clients whose money he stole weren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. They were people I'd known for decades, people who'd trusted me. The media had a field day. And here's where the racial dynamics got ugly. Every headline seemed to emphasize the same details: black financial advisors, white son-in-law, and minority-owned firm embroiled in fraud. The stories always mentioned my race in the first paragraph, like it was somehow relevant to Brandon's crimes. Some articles included my photo right next to Brandon's mugshot, as if we'd been co-conspirators. as if I'd known. Television news trucks parked outside our office for 3 days straight. Reporters ambushed me in parking lots shouting questions about whether I'd helped Brandon hide the money, whether this was a family conspiracy. One particularly vicious blog post suggested that I'd used Brandon as a front man to gain the trust of white clients, then stolen their money together. The comments section was worse. Racist garbage I won't repeat here. The lawsuits came fast. Civil suits from clients who lost their retirement savings. Criminal proceedings that cleared me legally after 6 months of investigation, but destroyed me professionally in the process. Even after the FBI confirmed I had no knowledge of Brandon's scheme, even after they proved he'd forged every single signature, even after they arrested him and charged him with wire fraud and embezzlement, the damage was done. Some of my white clients looked at me differently after that. I could see it in their eyes during depositions, hear it in their voices during phone calls. Suspicion, doubt, questions they wouldn't ask directly but hung in the air between us. How could you not know? Wasn't he your son-in-law? Didn't you check the accounts? As if I should have expected a family member to betray me. As if trust within your own family was somehow naive. My business partners quietly distanced themselves. Clients who'd been with me for 20 years requested their files be transferred to other firms. Industry colleagues who used to invite me to conferences suddenly stopped returning calls. My professional networks built over 4 decades evaporated in weeks. By Christmas, the company was bankrupt. My legal fees alone had consumed most of my savings. The remaining funds went to partial restitution for affected clients, even though I wasn't legally required to pay. It felt like the right thing to do, the only thing to do. But it left me with almost nothing. The Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation revoked my license pending completion of the criminal investigation. Even though I was eventually cleared, the stigma remained. Nobody wanted financial advice from the man whose own family had robbed them blind. Nobody wanted to trust their money to someone who'd been so publicly humiliated. At 71 years old, I was unemployable in the only profession I'd ever known. By January, I had $47 in my checking account and a growing sense of panic I'd never experienced before. Not even during the lean years when I was first building my business. Back then, I'd been young and hungry with everything ahead of me. Now I was 71, watching my entire legacy collapse, wondering if I'd end up homeless. I moved out of my Lincoln Park condo into a studio apartment on the south side, 400 square feet, thin walls, radiator that clanked all night long. My new neighbors were working families, recent immigrants, people grinding just to survive. Nobody there cared about my fall from grace. They had their own struggles. It was humbling in a way I desperately needed. I helped Diane with my grandkids Marcus and Zoe while she worked double shifts at the hospital. Watching them became my lifeline. Marcus was 7, obsessed with dinosaurs and basketball. Zoe was 5 with braids her mother spent hours perfecting every Sunday and a laugh that could light up the darkest days. They didn't know Grandpa used to manage millions. They just knew I made them pancakes and read them stories. It reminded me that worth isn't measured in dollars, but I still needed income. Social Security wasn't enough to cover rent and help Diane with groceries. My retirement accounts had been drained by legal fees. I had no choice but to look for work, which at 71 with a very public scandal attached to my name proved nearly impossible. I applied to 43 positions in 3 months. Retail stores said I was overqualified. Banks wouldn't touch me with my recent history. Financial firms laughed at my resume. One interviewer actually asked if I was planning to steal from them too. I walked out before he finished the sentence. That's when I saw the Help Wanted sign at Murphy's Diner, handwritten in marker on yellow legal paper taped to the window. Dishwasher or wait staff, cash paid daily. No experience necessary, no questions asked. Tommy Murphy, the owner, was a white guy in his 50s with a beer gut and a Chicago accent thick as concrete. He looked at my application, which listed my education and experience honestly, and raised an eyebrow. "You really a financial consultant?" he asked. "Was," I said. "Then my son-in-law decided to commit fraud using my company." Tommy nodded slowly. "You ever wait tables before?" "I served people for 30 years, I said, just in a different context. He hired me on the spot, paid $7 an hour plus tips, lunch shift Tuesday through Saturday. It wasn't much, but it was honest work that paid in cash at the end of each day. No background checks that would dredge up news articles. No corporate HR departments that would Google my name and reject my application. Just Tommy the diner and customers who wanted their coffee hot and their eggs cooked right. The work was harder than managing million-dollar portfolios. My feet ached after every shift. My back protested carrying heavy trays. I burned my hand on a hot plate my second day and had to serve customers with bandaged fingers. But there was something clean about it, something real. Nobody at Murphy's cared who I used to be. They cared whether I refilled their coffee fast enough. That simplicity felt like grace. 3 months into my new life as a waiter on a Thursday morning in March, everything changed. The breakfast rush was winding down. I was refilling coffee for the regulars, the construction workers and nurses coming off night shifts who knew their orders by heart when the door opened and he walked in. Richard Blackstone. Though I didn't know his name yet. What I knew was the expensive suit, charcoal gray with pinstripes so fine they probably cost extra. Italian leather shoes that clicked against the worn linoleum like they were offended to be there. A watch on his wrist that caught the fluorescent light, the kind of timepiece that cost more than I'd made in the past 6 months of slinging hash and pouring coffee. He was 54, maybe 55, white with silver temples, and the kind of tan that came from winter vacations in places where winter didn't exist. He carried himself like a man who'd never been told no in any context that mattered. The kind of confidence that comes not from achievement, but from never having to prove yourself in the first place. He chose the corner booth, slid in without looking at the cracked vinyl, and immediately pulled out his phone. Then, without headphones or any apparent concern for the dozen other customers trying to enjoy their breakfast, he started conducting a business call on speakerphone. "Tell Davidson we're not accepting his counteroffer," Richard said, his voice cutting across the diner like he was in a boardroom. "The Miami property is worth twice what he's proposing, and he knows it. If he wants to play hardball, we'll find another buyer by end of week." The other customers glanced up annoyed. Tommy caught my eye from behind the counter and jerked his head toward the corner booth. "Handle it." I approached the table, my server smile firmly in place, the one I'd perfected over 3 months of dealing with customers who saw waiters as furniture that occasionally brought food. "Excuse me, sir. I'm going to need you to lower your voice or take that call outside. Other customers are trying to enjoy their breakfast." Richard looked up at me with the expression of a man noticing a fly had landed on his table. His pale blue eyes did a quick assessment, categorizing me somewhere between irrelevant and mildly irritating. He held up one finger in a wait gesture like I was a child interrupting adult conversation. "Hold on," he said into the phone, then to me, "Coffee, black, and whatever passes for eggs Benedict in this establishment." He never actually paused his conversation, just waved me away and kept talking now about crushing some competitor's quarterly projections. His papers were spread across the table like he was conducting merger negotiations at the United Nations. Financial statements, acquisition proposals, spreadsheets with numbers that made my trained eye start analyzing before I could stop myself. I poured his coffee, biting back the response I wanted to give. 20 minutes later, he was still talking. Now he'd moved on to some real estate deal in Miami, discussing leverage and cash flow with enough volume that customers 3 booths away could hear every word. The construction workers were shooting dirty looks. The nurses looked exhausted and annoyed. Tommy was giving me the "handle this, or you're fired" stare from behind the register. I returned to his table. "Sir, I really need you to lower your voice or take that call outside." Richard held up that finger again. Into the phone, "Give me 1 second." Then he looked at me with the full weight of his irritation, like I was a particularly persistent mosquito. "Do you understand that this call is worth more than you'll make in your entire lifetime?" The diner went completely silent. Even the coffee maker seemed to stop gurgling. Every head turned toward the corner booth. Toward me, the 73-year-old black waiter being dressed down by the white businessman in the expensive suit. I felt the familiar burn of humiliation creeping up my neck. The same feeling I'd had during every news interview about Brandon's fraud, every deposition where lawyers implied I must have known every moment when people looked at me like I was either a criminal or a fool. But then I looked down at his papers. Really looked at them. Financial statements for Blackstone Enterprises. Merger documents with leverage ratios that made my stomach turn. Acquisition proposals built on debt structures that were teetering like a house of cards in a windstorm. I'd seen these patterns before. Too many times, and they always ended the same way. "Actually, sir," I said, my voice carrying across the quiet diner, "I understand that you're about to lose everything you think you own. Richard's expression shifted from annoyance to disbelief. "Excuse me, those leverage ratios." I gestured at the papers spread across his table, careful not to touch them. "They're dangerous. Your cash flow structure appears fundamentally unstable. Based on what I can see here, you're carrying more debt than your asset base can reasonably support. If I had to guess, you've got maybe 6 months before your creditors start circling, maybe less if interest rates tick up or one of your major deals falls through." The silence in the diner was now absolute. Richard stared at me like I'd started speaking in tongues. "I'm sorry," he said slowly, his voice dripping with condescension. "I don't recall asking for financial advice from the waiter." A few customers chuckled. That uncomfortable laughter that happens when someone with power humiliates someone without it. I felt every eye in the room on me, the old black man in the stained apron being put in his place by the wealthy white businessman, the natural order of things reasserting itself. But I was done being put in places, done swallowing humiliation like it was medicine I deserved. "You're right," I said, my voice steady. "You didn't ask. But if you had, I'd tell you to get a comprehensive audit of your entire financial structure before it's too late. What I can see from here suggests you're heading for serious trouble. The kind of trouble that doesn't care how expensive your suit is or how loud you talk on phone calls." Richard's face went through several color changes, landing somewhere between red and purple. "And what exactly qualifies you to make such bold predictions about my business?" "Experience," I said simply. "I've seen enough balance sheets to recognize warning signs even from scattered documents on a diner table." He stood abruptly, gathering his papers like I'd contaminated them somehow. "That's quite enough. I don't know where you think you learned to read financial statements, but your analysis is completely off base." "Walter Davis," I said quietly. "Davis and Partners Financial Consulting. I managed portfolios for 30 years before my son-in-law destroyed my company. I've seen more financial disasters than you've had board meetings, and yours has all the classic warning signs." Richard froze, his papers clutched against his chest. He stared at me for a long moment, his expression cycling through disbelief, recognition, and something that might have been fear. I could see the moment it clicked. Walter Davis. The name was familiar. The scandal had been all over the Chicago financial news 2 years ago. Black financial advisor whose white son-in-law committed fraud. The narrative had been inescapable. "That's impossible," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. His eyes traveled over me again, this time really seeing me, not the waiter in the stained apron, the man underneath, the professional who'd spent 3 decades in boardrooms and corner offices before ending up here. I watched him reassess everything, his assumptions about who I was, what I knew, why I was here. I could practically see the wheels turning. This wasn't some random waiter with delusions of expertise. This was a man who'd actually walked the walk, who'd managed the kind of money Richard was currently hemorrhaging, who knew what he was looking at when he saw those financial statements. And more than that, I could see Richard confronting something uncomfortable, his own bias. He'd walked into this diner and seen an old black man in an apron and made instant assumptions about intelligence, capability, relevance. Now those assumptions were crumbling, and he didn't quite know how to process it. "I would need to see your full financials to be certain," I said, pouring myself a cup of coffee with hands that weren't shaking anymore. 3 months of carrying heavy trays had steadied them. "But if you want a professional opinion, a real one, I'll be here tomorrow morning, 6 a.m., before the breakfast rush." Richard stood there, another moment, papers still clutched to his chest, mouth slightly open. Then he turned and walked out without another word. Left his coffee untouched. Never paid for the eggs Benedict he'd ordered. Tommy looked at me from behind the register with raised eyebrows. The other customers slowly went back to their meals, conversations resuming in low murmurs. I cleared Richard's table, wiped down the vinyl, reset the salt and pepper shakers. Just another booth. Just another customer. But my hands were steady, and my head was clear for the first time in 2 years. Because in that moment, calling out what I saw in those financial statements using the expertise I thought I'd lost forever, I'd remembered something crucial. They could take my company. They could take my money, my reputation, my license. They could plaster my face across the news and attach scandal to my name, but they couldn't take what I knew. The decades of experience, the pattern recognition, the ability to look at numbers and see the story they told, that was mine. It lived in my head, in my gut, in instincts honed over 40 years, and no FBI raid or media circus or bankrupt company could touch it. I finished my shift, split $73 in tips with the other server, and walked home to my studio apartment thinking about leverage ratios and cash flow structures. Thinking about a wealthy white businessman who'd walked into a diner expecting nothing but coffee and got a diagnosis he didn't want to hear, wondering if he'd actually show up tomorrow, wondering if I even wanted him to, but I knew he would, because I'd seen the fear in his eyes when I'd named the timeline, 6 months. And I'd seen enough desperate men to recognize one staring failure in the face. The next morning I arrived at Murphy's at 5:30 to start prep work. Coffee brewing, grill heating, syrup bottles filled and ready. The sky was still dark, that pre-dawn gray that makes Chicago feel like it exists outside of time. Rain tapped against the windows, steady and cold. March in Chicago meant winter hadn't quite given up yet. At exactly 6 a.m., someone knocked on the glass door. 3 sharp raps. I looked up from the coffee station, and there he was. Richard Blackstone, standing in the rain without an umbrella, looking like he'd aged 5 years overnight. His designer suit was wrinkled, the kind of wrinkles that come from wearing the same clothes too long, from sitting in one position for hours without moving. His silver hair, which had been perfectly styled yesterday, now stuck up at odd angles like he'd been running his hands through it all night. Those expensive Italian leather shoes were soaked through dark with water. He clutched a manila folder against his chest, like it contained the only thing keeping him alive. I unlocked the door and stepped aside. He walked in without meeting my eyes, tracking water across the floor Tommy had made me mop last night. He looked smaller somehow. Yesterday's confidence had evaporated, leaving behind something raw and desperate. "We're not open for another hour," I said, more statement than challenge. "I know." His voice was hoarse, like he'd been talking or maybe shouting for hours. "I need to talk to you about what you said yesterday." I studied him for a moment, the tremor in his hands as he held that folder, the dark circles under his eyes, the way he stood there dripping rainwater onto the linoleum, a man who probably had a driver and an assistant, and people whose entire job was making his life convenient, but who'd driven himself here at dawn because he couldn't wait another minute. "Coffee?" I asked. He nodded, sliding into the same corner booth he'd occupied yesterday. His hands shook slightly as he opened the folder and began spreading papers across the table. Financial statements, audit reports, cash flow projections, the kind of documents that told the real story behind the public image. I poured 2 cups of coffee black and carried them to the booth. Sat down across from him without asking permission. We weren't customer and waiter anymore. The script had changed. "I spent all night going through my books," Richard said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Called my accountant at 10 p.m., made him pull everything. Bank statements, loan documents, asset valuations. Every single financial record from the past 2 years. He pushed a spreadsheet toward me. I recognized the format. Professional audit summary, the kind accountants charge 5 figures to produce. My eyes scanned the columns, the red numbers, the ratios that told the story I'd already guessed. "He confirmed it," Richard continued. "Everything you said. The leverage is unsustainable. The cash flow is built on assumptions that aren't holding. The Miami deal is hemorrhaging money with no realistic path to profitability. If interest rates go up even half a point, or if one major client backs out, the whole structure collapses." "How long did he say you have?" 4 months, maybe 5 if we're lucky. Richard's hands were flat on the table now, pressing down like he needed to feel something solid. "Maybe less if word gets out that we're in trouble. Creditors start calling loans, partners get nervous, clients pull their contracts. It cascades fast." I sipped my coffee, letting him sit with it. The fear, the reality, the difference between thinking you might have a problem and knowing for certain that you do. "How did you see it so quickly?" he asked, finally looking up at me. "My own financial team didn't catch what you spotted in 20 minutes from across a diner booth." "Your financial team gets paid to tell you what you want to hear," I said simply. "I don't." Richard made a sound that might have been a laugh if it had any humor in it. "That's the problem, isn't it? I'm surrounded by yes men. People who work for me who need me to be right because their jobs depend on it. My CFO has been warning me for 6 months that we're overextended, but I kept pushing, kept thinking one more deal, one more acquisition, and we'd turn the corner." "That's how it always happens," I said. "You chase growth instead of stability. You believe your own press releases. You think the rules that apply to everyone else somehow don't apply to you because you've been lucky for so long." He flinched at that. Lucky. Because that's what success often is, especially at the top. The right timing, the right connections, the right color skin, and the right rooms. Not that Richard had done nothing to earn his wealth, but he'd also never had to work twice as hard for half the recognition. Never had to prove he belonged in spaces that weren't built for people who looked like him. My accountant asked me where I got the analysis, Richard said. Who'd done such a thorough diagnostic? I told him it was a consultant I'd hired. I didn't tell him it was a waiter at Murphy's Diner who spent 30 seconds looking at papers on a table. Why not? Because he would have laughed, because I would have sounded insane, because the idea that a 73-year-old man serving eggs could diagnose my company's problems faster than my entire financial team is humiliating. And yet here you are, I said. And yet here I am. Richard leaned forward, his voice taking on an edge of desperation I recognized from my own mirror 2 years ago. I need your help, Walter. I don't know what that looks like or what it costs or how we'd even structure it, but I need someone who can see through the noise and tell me the truth. Someone who's not on my payroll, who doesn't have skin in the game, who won't sugarcoat things to keep their job. I'm a waiter, I reminded him. I serve coffee and take orders for eggs. I haven't touched a financial consulting project in 2 years. And when I did, it ended with FBI raids and my face on the news. Because your son-in-law was a thief, Richard said bluntly. Not because you were incompetent. The words hit me like a physical thing. I set down my coffee cup carefully, afraid my hands might start shaking. In 2 years, through all the investigations and lawsuits and news coverage, nobody had said that to me. Not quite like that. Not with such simple certainty. Everyone had hedged. My lawyers said, the evidence suggests you had no knowledge of the fraud. The FBI said, we found no indication of your involvement. Even friends said, I never believed you knew what he was doing. Always that qualifier. Always that distance. But Richard said it plain. Your son-in-law was a thief, not because you were incompetent, drawing a line between Brandon's actions and my character, between what happened and who I was. Besides, Richard continued, what do you have to lose? You're working at a diner for $7 an hour plus tips. I'm offering you a chance to do what you were born to do, what you spent 40 years mastering. And if it doesn't work, if my company collapses anyway, at least you tried. At least you got back in the game one more time. I looked at this white man, this billionaire who'd walked into a diner yesterday with all the arrogance of someone who'd never experienced real failure, now sitting across from me begging for help. His privilege hadn't saved him. His connections hadn't warned him. His expensive team hadn't seen what I saw. And now he needed a 73-year-old black man who'd lost everything to save him from losing the same. There was something almost poetic about it, something that felt like the universe correcting an imbalance I'd been living with my whole life. The idea that maybe, just maybe, expertise mattered more than appearances, that knowledge mattered more than assumptions, that a man's worth wasn't determined by where he worked or what he'd lost, but by what he knew and who he chose to be. I'd need to do this legally, I said slowly. I maintained my Series 66 license and kept my LLC active. Old habits. Never thought I'd need them again. Richard's expression shifted to something approaching hope. You still have your credentials. Financial advising was my life for 40 years, I said. Even after everything collapsed, I couldn't quite let go completely. Paid the renewal fees, kept the paperwork current, told myself it was foolish that I'd never use them again, but I couldn't make myself cancel them. Then we can do this properly. Richard pulled out his phone. Draw up a real contract, pay you as a legitimate consultant. Not so fast. I held up a hand. If we're doing this, we're doing it on my terms. I'd need complete access. Every bank statement, every loan document, every contract and agreement. No secrets, no off-limits files. If there's something you don't want me to see, I walk right now. Richard nodded. Done. I'd need authority to make real recommendations. If I say restructure something, you consider it seriously. If I say liquidate an asset, you evaluate it honestly. I'm not doing this to write a report you'll ignore. I'm doing this to save your company or tell you it can't be saved. Understood. And I'd need my old consulting rate. I named a figure that made his eyebrows rise. Plus equity. If I save your company, if I turn this around, I own part of it. Because I'm not doing this for a paycheck. I'm doing this because if I'm going to put my name on something again, I want skin in the game. Richard was quiet for a long moment, calculating. I could see him weighing the cost against the alternative. Bankruptcy, creditors, lawsuits, public failure. The kind of fall from grace I knew intimately. Finally, he nodded. Agreed. But I have one condition, which is, we position this as bringing in independent strategic consulting, professional turnaround expertise from Davis Strategic Consulting. My board doesn't need to know you've been working at Murphy's Diner. They don't need to know about the scandal 2 years ago. As far as they're concerned, you're a respected consultant I've hired to provide fresh perspective. I almost laughed. From senior partner to waiter to independent consultant. At least the trajectory was pointing upward again. Ashamed to admit you found your financial savior serving eggs. Ashamed to admit I need outside help at all, Richard corrected. My board is already questioning my leadership. Half of them think I'm overextended. The other half think I'm not aggressive enough. If I bring in a turnaround consultant, they'll smell blood in the water. Start positioning for my removal. I need this to look like strength, not weakness. I understood. In the corporate world, admitting you needed help was like showing your throat to predators. Every board member with ambition would see it as an opportunity. Every competitor would see it as confirmation of rumors. The optics mattered almost as much as the actual financials. Fair enough, I said. When do we start? Richard pulled out his phone immediately and dialed. Put it on speaker. James, it's Richard. I need you to prepare a complete financial package for Davis Strategic Consulting. Everything. Yes, everything. Bank statements, loan documents, asset valuations, client contracts, partnership agreements. I want it ready by noon today. He hung up and looked at me with something approaching hope in his eyes. Welcome back to the game, Walter Davis. I refilled his coffee cup, my hands steady. The same hands that had shaken while serving customers yesterday. The same hands that had trembled while signing away my company 2 years ago, but steady now, certain. Let's see if I remember how to play, I said. But I knew I did. Some things you don't forget. Some expertise lives in your bones, in your gut, in instincts honed over decades. They can take your office and your reputation and your bank account, but they can't take what you know. And I knew financial structures. I knew leverage and risk and cash flow. I knew how to read between the lines of balance sheets and see the truth people tried to hide. Richard stood to leave, then paused. Thank you. For this. For giving me a chance. Don't thank me yet, I said. We still have a company to save, and something tells me it's going to be harder than either of us expects. Richard's office occupied the entire 42nd floor of Blackstone Tower, all glass and steel and views that stretched across Lake Michigan like they'd been purchased separately. The kind of space that announced success before anyone said a word. Floor-to-ceiling windows, conference tables that could seat 20 artwork that probably cost more than my entire career earnings. When I stepped off the elevator, Richard's assistant James was waiting. White guy, maybe 30, with the kind of haircut that required maintenance appointments in a suit that fit too well to be off the rack. He looked at me like I was a particularly confusing puzzle. An old black man in a department store suit that had seen better days carrying a briefcase I'd dug out of storage that morning claiming to be a consultant Richard had personally hired. Mr. Davis, he said, the title sounding like it physically hurt him to say. Mr. Blackstone asked me to provide you with these. He handed over 3 thick folders and a tablet. Complete financial records for the past 24 months. Bank statements, loan documents, asset valuations, client contracts, everything. His tone suggested that giving me access to this information violated every professional instinct he had. I could see him trying to reconcile what he was being told to do with what his eyes were telling him. This couldn't possibly be the expert consultant Richard needed. This had to be some kind of mistake. Thank you, James, I said, taking the materials. Is there a conference room I can use? Mr. Blackstone is in meetings until 3, he said, gesturing down the hall. Conference room B is available. Would you like coffee? Water? I'm good. Been making my own coffee for the past 3 months. James blinked, not sure how to respond to that. Mr. Blackstone said to give you whatever you need. Full access to our financial systems, our accounting team, anything. Perfect, I said, heading toward the conference room. I work better without an audience anyway. I caught the look James gave my back as I walked away. Skepticism mixed with something like concern. Wondering what Richard had gotten himself into hiring some unknown consultant who showed up looking like someone's grandfather rather than a financial expert. I didn't blame him. If I'd been in his position, I would have had questions too. But I'd stopped caring about appearances a long time ago. Around the same time, I'd started pouring coffee for $7 an hour. 3 hours later, I understood exactly why Richard had looked like a man staring at his own execution. Blackstone Enterprises wasn't just in trouble. It was in catastrophic, potentially unrecoverable trouble. The kind that made financial advisors wake up in cold sweats. The Miami real estate project alone was a disaster that defied description. Richard had leveraged everything to acquire a beachfront development that was supposed to be luxury condos catering to wealthy retirees. Except the market had shifted, construction costs had doubled, and environmental regulations had added another 18 months to the timeline. He was bleeding $3 million a quarter with no revenue coming in and at least 2 more years before the first unit could be sold. But Miami was just the biggest problem. There were others. A tech startup acquisition that had looked promising on paper but was now embroiled in patent litigation. A partnership with a European firm that was collapsing because of currency fluctuations Richard hadn't hedged against. A commercial real estate portfolio in secondary markets that was underwater because he'd bought at the peak. Every deal had the same signature. Aggressive leverage, optimistic projections, assumption of best-case scenarios. Richard had been gambling, doubling down every time convinced his luck would hold. And for a while it had. But luck always runs out eventually. I filled 3 whiteboards with notes, diagrams, cash flow projections. The picture that emerged was grim. In 4 months, maybe 5, several major loan payments would come due simultaneously. Unless Richard could refinance or generate significant new revenue, he wouldn't be able to cover them. The creditors would call the loans. Assets would be seized. The whole empire would collapse like a house of cards. But here's what caught my attention. Buried in all the chaos and all the high-profile disasters Richard was chasing, there was a pattern of smaller investments that didn't fit. Tech startups, yes, but not the flashy ones making headlines. Biomedical research companies working on unglamorous problems like diabetes management and prosthetic improvements. Clean energy projects focused on grid efficiency rather than solar panels everyone could see. And these investments, these quiet ones nobody was paying attention to, were actually making money, not massive returns, but steady, reliable, growing revenue, 8 to 12% annually, the kind of boring, sustainable growth that serious investors love and attention-seeking billionaires ignore. Richard had stumbled into some genuinely good investments. He just couldn't see them because he was too busy chasing the deals that would get him on magazine covers. The biomedical company had just signed 3 major hospital contracts. One of the clean energy firms had patents that utilities were starting to license. A software startup nobody had heard of was quietly becoming essential infrastructure for mid-sized manufacturing companies. If you stripped away all the ego-driven disasters and focused only on these investments, you'd have a profitable, sustainable portfolio. Not exciting, not front-page news, but real, solid. The kind of foundation you could actually build something on. The problem was getting there. Richard would have to admit failure publicly. Sell the Miami disaster at a massive loss. Liquidate the partnerships and acquisitions that weren't working. Take the hit to his reputation and his ego. Most billionaires would rather die than do that, literally. I'd seen men drive their companies into bankruptcy rather than admit they'd made mistakes. At 3:15, Richard walked into the conference room looking exhausted. His meetings had clearly not gone well. He loosened his tie, poured himself water from the pitcher James had brought in at some point, and sat down heavily in one of the leather chairs. "How bad is it?" he asked. "Worse than you think," I said, "but not as hopeless as it looks." He laughed, a sound without any humor in it. "That's an interesting combination. Do I want to know the details?" I walked him through the analysis, the Miami disaster, the over-leveraged acquisitions, the partnerships that were draining resources with no path to profitability. Every board I pointed to showed another problem, another decision made for the wrong reasons. His face grew paler with each revelation. "So what you're telling me," Richard said slowly when I'd finished, "is that I've been systematically destroying my own company for the past 3 years, chasing deals that made me look successful while ignoring the investments that were actually making money. That's one way to put it. Is there a better way? You're a successful businessman who started believing his own press releases," I said. "It happens. Success makes you confident. Confidence makes you take risks. Risks pay off a few times and suddenly you think you're invincible. You stop listening to the people who tell you no. You start thinking the rules that apply to everyone else don't apply to you." Richard stood up and walked to the windows, looking out at the city spread below him. "You know what the worst part is? I had people warning me. My CFO has been saying for a year that we're overextended. My oldest partner suggested we slow down on acquisitions. Even my ex-wife, who hasn't spoken to me in 5 years, sent me an email 6 months ago saying I was acting reckless. But you didn't listen. But I didn't listen. Because I'm Richard Blackstone. Because I'd turned a $10 million inheritance into a $2 billion empire. Because magazines wrote articles about my aggressive acquisition strategy. Because other billionaires asked me for advice. How could I be wrong when everyone was telling me how smart I was? He turned back to face me. So tell me honestly, Walter, am I an idiot? You're a man who made mistakes, I said carefully. There's a difference. An idiot doesn't have the self-awareness to recognize when they're wrong. An idiot doesn't hire someone to tell them the truth. An idiot doesn't show up at a diner at 6 in the morning because they're desperate enough to listen. That's generous. It's accurate. You want me to tell you you're an idiot? Fine. You're an idiot. You took a fundamentally sound business and nearly destroyed it because your ego needed feeding. You surrounded yourself with yes men who were too afraid or too financially dependent to tell you the truth. You chased headlines instead of profits. You let pride drive decisions that should have been driven by data. That idiotic enough for you. Richard actually smiled at that. Brutal honesty strikes again. You hired me to tell you the truth. I'm delivering as advertised. So what's the solution? Or is there one? I turned to the whiteboard where I'd mapped out the profitable investments. There's a solution, but you're going to hate it, because it requires you to do the thing successful men hate most. Admit you were wrong, publicly, spectacularly, in a way that everyone will see and remember. I'm listening. We sell Miami, take the loss however massive it is and get that hemorrhage stopped. We liquidate the 3 underperforming subsidiaries. The tech startup in litigation, the European partnership, the underwater real estate portfolio. We take those hits now before they get worse. That's going to cost me hundreds of millions in losses. It's going to save you from losing billions, I corrected. Then we double down on these. I pointed to the quiet investments, the ones making steady money. We reallocate everything to the biomedical companies, the clean energy firms, the software startups nobody's talking about. We build a boring, sustainable portfolio that generates reliable returns. Boring doesn't make headlines. Boring doesn't go bankrupt either. Richard stared at the whiteboard for a long time, his jaw working like he was physically chewing on the implications. If I do this, if I sell Miami and liquidate those other investments, the board is going to have questions. They're going to want detailed justification for why we're abandoning projects I've been promoting for years. Some of them are going to see it as an admission that I've been wrong, that my strategy has failed. They would be correct, I said. Your strategy has failed. The question is whether you want to admit that now and save the company or pretend everything's fine and watch it collapse in 4 months. The media will have a field day. Blackstone Enterprises in crisis. Richard Blackstone forced to sell assets at huge losses. My competitors will smell blood. Let them. The alternative is bankruptcy proceedings and creditors selling your assets for pennies on the dollar. At least this way you control the narrative. You bring in a turnaround consultant, me, who identified inefficiencies and recommended strategic divestment. It's not failure, it's optimization. It's not weakness, it's smart business. You make it sound simple. It's not simple at all. It's going to be painful and expensive and humiliating. Your competitors will mock you. Some of your partners will lose confidence. You might lose board members, but you'll still have a company, and that company will be on solid ground instead of quicksand. Richard walked back to the table and sat down, spreading his hands on the surface like he needed to feel something solid. I built this company from almost nothing. My father left me $10 million and I turned it into something real, something that mattered. The idea of tearing it down, even partially, even to save it, feels like admitting defeat. That's ego talking, I said. And ego is what got you into this mess. I understand the impulse. I really do. But this isn't about your pride anymore, Richard. It's about survival. It's about whether you want to be the man who admitted mistakes and saved his company, or the man who was too proud to change course and lost everything. He was quiet for a long moment. Outside the windows, the sun was starting to set over the lake, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, the kind of view that cost millions to access. The kind of view Richard might lose if he didn't make the hard choices. Walk me through the timeline, he finally said. If we do this, all of it, how long until we're stable? I pulled up the projections I'd built. If we move fast, we can have Miami sold within 60 days. Take a $200 million loss, but stop the bleeding immediately. The subsidiary liquidations will take longer, maybe 4 to 6 months, but we can start the process immediately. Meanwhile, we redirect all available capital to the profitable investments. Pump another $50 million into the biomedical research fund, the clean energy expansion, support the software startup's growth. In 6 months, maybe 8, you'll be cash flow positive again. Not growing as fast as you were, but growing sustainably. In 12 months, you'll have worked through most of the bad debt. In 18 months, you'll be stable enough to start considering new acquisitions, though I'd recommend against that until you've rebuilt your cash reserves. 2 years to undo 3 years of mistakes. Could be worse. Could be bankruptcy and liquidation. Could be losing everything and starting over at 56 with nothing but debt and damaged reputation. Richard looked at me sharply. That was my story I was telling. Starting over at 71 with nothing but debt and damaged reputation. The parallel wasn't lost on him. "What would you do?" he asked. "If you were me right now, would you do it?" "I'd do it in a heartbeat," I said. "Because I know what the alternative looks like. I've lived it. And if I could have saved my company by swallowing my pride and making hard choices, I would have done it without hesitation. Your son-in-law didn't give me that option. He made the choice for me, and I've spent 2 years living with the consequences. You still have a choice. You still have time. Don't waste it because you're afraid of what people will think." Richard nodded slowly. "The board meeting is Thursday. 4 days. Can you have a full presentation ready? Something detailed enough to justify the strategy, compelling enough to get them to vote yes? I can have it ready by tomorrow if you need it." "Thursday is fine. Gives me time to talk to some of the board members individually, prepare them for what's coming." He stood up and extended his hand. "Thank you, Walter, for seeing what everyone else missed, for being willing to tell me the truth even when it's hard to hear." I shook his hand. "Don't thank me yet. We still have to convince your board. And something tells me that's going to be the hardest part of all." The board meeting took place on Thursday afternoon in the main conference room, the one with the massive table that could seat 20 and windows that overlooked the entire city. 11 board members filed in, most of them white men in their 50s and 60s who'd made their fortunes in real estate, finance, or tech. A few women, a couple of minorities in the mix, but the room still had that old money feeling, the kind of space where decisions affecting billions of dollars got made over coffee and Danish. I sat at Richard's right hand as he introduced me. "This is Walter Davis from Davis Strategic Consulting. I've brought him in to conduct an independent financial analysis and provide recommendations for strategic restructuring. Walter has over 40 years of experience in financial management and portfolio optimization. I've asked him to present his findings." I stood connecting my laptop to the projector, pulling up the presentation I'd spent 3 days perfecting. Graphs, charts, financial projections, the language of money that everyone in this room spoke fluently. "Gentlemen, ladies," I began, "Blackstone Enterprises is currently facing a severe liquidity crisis that, if left unaddressed, will result in bankruptcy within 4 to 5 months. The core issue is over-leveraging across multiple high-profile acquisitions combined with cash flow negative projects that are consuming resources at an unsustainable rate." I walked them through the analysis: the Miami disaster, the failing partnerships, the underwater investments. With each slide, I watched their faces shift from skepticism to concern to something approaching alarm. These were smart people who understood numbers. They could see what I was showing them was real. But then I got to my recommendations. Sell Miami at a massive loss. Liquidate 3 major subsidiaries. Refocus the entire portfolio on smaller, less glamorous investments. That's when Leonard Webb spoke up. Webb was the board chairman, 58 years old, with silver hair and the kind of face that looked like it had been carved from granite. Old money family, inherited wealth, the type who'd never had to prove himself because his last name did it for him. He sat at the far end of the table, fingers steepled, looking at me like I was proposing something obscene. "This is madness," he declared, his voice cutting across the room. "You're proposing we abandon our most high-profile investments, the projects that have defined Blackstone's growth strategy for 3 years, the deals that put us on the map as a major player in commercial development. I'm proposing we abandon our most expensive mistakes," I replied calmly. "The data supports strategic divestiture of underperforming assets and reallocation to profitable sectors. The Miami project alone is consuming $3 million per quarter with no revenue and years until potential return. That's not an investment, Mr. Webb. That's a slow-motion disaster. And who exactly are you to make these determinations?" Webb leaned forward, his tone sharpening. "Davis Strategic Consulting. I've been in this business 30 years, and I've never heard of your firm. Where did you come from? What major turnarounds have you led?" The room went quiet. It was a reasonable question, but the way Webb asked it carried implications. The subtle suggestion that maybe Richard had made a mistake bringing in some unknown consultant, that maybe my credentials weren't quite what they seemed. "I spent 40 years managing investment portfolios in Chicago," I said evenly. "Most recently as senior partner at Davis & Partners Financial Consulting. My firm specialized in wealth management and portfolio optimization for high-net-worth clients." "Davis & Partners." Webb repeated the name slowly like he was trying to place it. Then I saw recognition flicker across his face. "That's the firm that was involved in that fraud scandal a few years back, isn't it? The embezzlement case that was all over the news." Several board members shifted in their seats. A few exchanged glances. I felt the atmosphere in the room change, that subtle shift when people start questioning credibility. "My son-in-law committed fraud using forged signatures," I said clearly. "I was fully cleared by federal investigators. The FBI confirmed I had no knowledge of his activities, but yes, that was my firm." "And now you're consulting." Webb's eyebrow raised slightly. "Interesting career trajectory. From managing your own firm to consulting for others. One might wonder why someone with your experience would be available for projects like this." The implication hung in the air. The suggestion that maybe I wasn't quite the expert Richard claimed, that maybe there were reasons I wasn't still running my own successful firm. Webb wasn't saying I was incompetent or criminal. He didn't have to. He was just planting seeds of doubt in the minds of everyone around the table. I could have gotten defensive, could have explained the whole story, how Brandon had destroyed my company, how I'd been working as a waiter 3 months ago, but that would only make things worse. So instead, I focused on what mattered. "The analysis stands regardless of who presents it," I said. "These numbers don't care about my history or Mr. Webb's concerns about my credentials. Blackstone Enterprises is over-leveraged and cash flow negative. Without significant restructuring, bankruptcy is inevitable. That's not opinion, that's math." I walked them through the rest of the presentation. The profitable investments that were being ignored, the reallocation strategy, the timeline to stability. When I finished, I asked for questions, got several about implementation details, timeline concerns, risk assessment. I answered each one with specifics, with data, with projections I'd built myself. Finally, Richard called for a vote. All in favor of implementing the strategic restructuring as outlined by Davis Strategic Consulting. 5 hands went up, then a 6th after a long pause. Richard made 7. Opposed, 4 hands including Webb's. Abstentions. 2 board members raised their hands, clearly uncomfortable making a decision either way. "The motion passes," Richard announced. "We'll begin implementation immediately." As the board members filed out, Webb approached Richard with the expression of someone who smelled opportunity in crisis. I was gathering my materials, but close enough to hear their exchange. "Bringing in outside consultants reeks of desperation, Richard," Webb said quietly, but not so quietly that several nearby board members couldn't hear. "The investors are already asking questions about our Q2 performance. When they hear we're liquidating major assets, they're going to wonder if there's more trouble than we're admitting. How long before they lose confidence entirely?" "As long as it takes to turn this company around," Richard replied, his voice steady, but I could hear the strain underneath. "And if it doesn't turn around, if Davis's strategy fails and we've sold our best assets for nothing, who takes responsibility then?" "I do. This is my company, Leonard. My decisions. My responsibility. For now." Webb let that hang in the air for a moment. "But board members have responsibilities too. To shareholders, to investors, to the long-term health of this company. If your leadership continues to be questioned, if results don't materialize quickly, there may be difficult conversations ahead." He walked out, leaving Richard standing there looking like he'd been punched in the gut. After the last board member left, Richard slumped into one of the leather chairs. "He's planning something," I observed. "I know," Richard said tiredly. "Leonard has wanted my position for years. He thinks he should be running Blackstone, that his family name and connections make him more qualified. Every mistake I make is ammunition for him. Every stumble is proof I'm not fit to lead." "He's not just positioning to replace you," I said carefully. "He's positioning for something bigger." "What do you mean, just a feeling?" The way he questioned my credentials tried to undermine the strategy without directly opposing it. He's building a narrative, creating doubt. That's not just about removing a CEO. That's about setting up a larger play. Like what? I don't know yet, but we need to move fast. Prove the strategy works before he can gather enough support to stop us. Over the next 2 weeks, I worked 18-hour days implementing the restructuring plan. Richard had given me authority to move quickly, and I used it. The Miami property went up for sale, immediately marketed to a development firm that specialized in distressed assets. They offered $150 million for a property Richard had invested $350 million in. It hurt, but we took it. Stop the bleeding. The 3 underperforming subsidiaries proved more complicated. The tech startup and patent litigation had some value if we could resolve the legal issues, so we brought in specialists to negotiate a settlement. Ended up paying $12 million to make the lawsuit go away, then sold the company to a larger tech firm for $60 million. Not great, but better than watching it die in court. The European partnership was easier. They wanted out as badly as we did. We agreed to an amicable dissolution split. The remaining assets walked away with minimal damage. The commercial real estate portfolio took longer. Had to find buyers willing to purchase underwater properties, negotiate terms that wouldn't completely destroy our balance sheet. Took hits on every property, but got them sold. Meanwhile, we redirected every dollar we could scrape together into the profitable investments. The biomedical research companies got funding to expand their hospital contracts. The clean energy firms got capital to scale their patent licensing. The software startup got resources to hire engineers and accelerate development, and slowly, painfully, the numbers started to improve. Cash flow became less negative each week. Revenue from the profitable investments began ticking upward. Debt payments got made on time. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would make headlines, just steady, boring progress toward stability. But Webb opposed every single decision. Every sale, every liquidation, every reallocation of resources. He demanded additional board meetings to review our progress. Questioned every projection, every timeline, every assumption. Made it clear he was documenting everything, building a case that Richard's leadership was failing. Some board members started listening to him, asking more pointed questions, expressing concern about the losses we were taking. Webb was careful never to directly challenge Richard's authority, just to keep raising doubts. Keep suggesting that maybe this restructuring wasn't the answer. Maybe we needed more fundamental change. 3 weeks into implementation, Webb called for another emergency board meeting to review the ongoing concerns about strategic direction and leadership decisions. When Richard told me about it, I could hear the exhaustion in his voice. "He's not going to stop," Richard said. "Every step forward we make, Leonard finds a way to frame it as failure. Every hard decision I make becomes evidence I'm not fit to lead. How do I fight someone who's determined to see me fail?" "You don't fight him directly," I said. "You succeed so obviously that he has no ground to stand on. We keep executing the plan, keep hitting our targets, make the results so clear that the board has no choice but to support you." But I had a feeling Webb wasn't going to make it that easy. One evening, about 4 weeks into the restructuring, I was working late in Richard's office reviewing the quarterly projections when something clicked. I'd been staring at the board composition, the voting patterns from our meetings, the timeline of Webb's challenges. And suddenly I saw it, the pattern I'd seen before years ago in another company's collapse. "Richard," I said when he came back from a dinner meeting, "we need to talk about Leonard Webb." He poured himself a scotch, something I'd noticed him doing more often lately. "What about him?" "He's not just trying to remove you, he's positioning himself for a takeover." Richard looked at me sharply. "What makes you say that?" "Pattern recognition. I've seen this play before." I pulled up my notes, the timeline I'd been building. Board chairman systematically undermines CEO, questions every decision, creates atmosphere of doubt and instability, doesn't directly challenge authority, just keeps raising concerns, makes everyone nervous. So far that just sounds like Leonard being Leonard. But here's where it gets interesting. While he's creating this crisis of confidence, he's also been quietly acquiring shares. I pulled the public filings. Webb has increased his stake in Blackstone by 14% over the past 6 months. Small purchases, nothing that raised red flags individually. But taken together, it's significant. Richard set down his glass. He's buying up shares while questioning my leadership. Classic move. Create chaos, drive down confidence, acquire shares at discount prices. Then when the moment is right, make your play. Either force a vote to remove you and take over himself, or position for a buyout where he profits enormously from the turmoil he helped create. That's Corporate raiding, hostile takeover tactics. It's not illegal if done carefully, and Webb is being very careful. I walked Richard through the pattern, how Webb had voted against the restructuring but not aggressively enough to seem obstructionist, how he'd questioned my credentials without directly accusing me of incompetence, how he'd raised concerns about Richard's leadership without ever calling for his removal, all calculated moves designed to create doubt while maintaining plausible deniability. He's waiting for the right moment, I explained, probably hoping the restructuring fails or takes longer than expected or creates some crisis he can exploit. Then he calls for a leadership change, presents himself as the stable alternative, and either takes over as CEO or forces a sale where he profits massively. How do you know all this? Richard asked. Because I've seen it happen, not to my company but to others I consulted for. It's a common playbook for ambitious board members with capital to deploy, create the crisis profit from the chaos. Richard walked to the windows looking out at the city lights. So what do? We do exactly what we've been doing. Execute the plan, hit our targets, make our success so obvious that the board has no choice but to support you. Meanwhile, we document everything. Every challenge Webb makes, every question he raises, every move he makes that seems designed to undermine rather than strengthen the company. And if that's not enough, then we prepare for a fight. Make sure we have the votes we need on the board. Shore up support with major shareholders. Get ready to expose what he's doing if necessary. But the best defense is success. If Blackstone is clearly recovering, if the numbers are undeniable, Webb loses his ammunition. How long do we have? Hard to say. Depends on how patient he is. But I'd guess he's planning to make his move soon. Maybe at the next quarterly review if he thinks he can spin our progress as inadequate. Maybe sooner if he sees an opportunity. Over the next month, despite Webb's interference, the recovery continued. The biomedical investments landed 2 more major hospital contracts, adding $4 million in quarterly revenue. The clean energy firms licensed 3 patents to utility companies in the Midwest, generating licensing fees that exceeded projections. The software startup signed contracts with 15 manufacturing companies, doubling their client base. Revenue stabilized, then began ticking upward. Debt payments were made on schedule with enough left over to start rebuilding cash reserves. The balance sheet that had looked like a disaster 6 weeks ago was starting to look manageable. Not great, not healthy yet, but survivable, and trending in the right direction. The board noticed. At our 6-week review, even some of Webb's allies admitted the strategy was working. One board member who'd voted against the restructuring said he'd been wrong that the results spoke for themselves. Another praised Richard for making hard decisions quickly, but Webb wasn't done. If anything, the success seemed to make him more aggressive. He called for another emergency board meeting, this one titled, Ongoing Concerns About Leadership and Strategic Direction. When Richard got the notice, he looked like he wanted to throw something. He's going to make his move, I said. The recovery is working, which means he's running out of time to create the crisis he needs. He's going to try to force the issue. What do you think he'll do? Question the sustainability of our gains, suggest they're temporary or fragile, raise doubts about whether the strategy can continue to work, try to create fear that'll override the evidence of success. Can he do that? If he's persuasive enough, if he has allies willing to back him up, if he can frame the narrative right, yes. Fear is powerful, Richard, even when the facts say otherwise. The emergency meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday. 4 days to prepare, 4 days to make sure we had the votes, the data, the narrative. 4 days before Webb would try to take everything Richard had built, and I had a feeling that meeting was going to be unlike anything we'd faced before. 3 weeks into our partnership, I was working late in Richard's office long after everyone else had gone home. The building was quiet except for the hum of ventilation and the occasional sound of the night cleaning crew down the hall. I was reviewing loan documents from 1997, trying to understand the foundation Richard had built his empire on when a photograph slipped out from between 2 pages. It was a family photo, the edges slightly worn like it had been handled many times before being forgotten in this file. Richard looked maybe 20 years younger, his hair still mostly dark, standing on a beach somewhere, with his arm around a woman with light brown hair and a smile that reached her eyes. 2 small children sat at their feet building what looked like a sandcastle. A boy and a girl, maybe 8 and 10 years old, their faces bright with that unself-conscious joy children have before life teaches them to be guarded. I stared at the photo for a long moment, feeling like I'd stumbled onto something private, something that explained more than any financial statement ever could about the man I'd been working with for the past month. "My family," Richard said from the doorway, startling me. I hadn't heard him come back. "Former family, I should say." I looked up. He was still in his suit, but the tie was loosened, the jacket draped over his arm. He looked exhausted in a way that went beyond just physical tiredness, the kind of exhaustion that lives in your bones. "I'm sorry," I said. "It fell out of the loan documents. I wasn't trying to pry." "It's okay." He walked over, took the photo from my hand, studied it with an expression I couldn't quite read. Pain, maybe, or nostalgia, or both. "Linda, my wife, and the kids, Michael and Sarah. This was taken in Cape Cod summer of 2009, one of the last good vacations we had before everything fell apart." He sat down in the chair across from me, still holding the photo. "You asked me once why I'd been making increasingly risky investments, why I kept chasing bigger and bigger deals even when the smart play was to consolidate. I didn't have a good answer then, but the truth is in this picture. I waited knowing whatever came next was going to be important, the kind of thing people only share when they're too tired to keep the walls up anymore." "They died," Richard said quietly. "Car accident. Drunk driver ran a red light at an intersection 3 blocks from our house. Michael was 8, Sarah was 10. Linda died at the scene. The kids died in the ambulance on the way to the hospital. All 3 of them gone in less than an hour, and I wasn't even there. I was at the office working on some acquisition that seemed important at the time." The words hung in the air between us. I felt my chest tighten, that physical reaction to someone else's profound loss. The kind of grief that doesn't diminish with time, just becomes something you learn to carry. "Jesus, Richard," I said. "I'm so sorry." It was 15 years ago. His voice was steady but hollow, like he'd told this story enough times that he could do it without breaking. September 14th, 2010. I remember every detail of that day. What I was wearing, what I was working on, the exact moment my assistant came into my office and said I needed to come to the hospital right away. The drive there, thinking maybe it wasn't as bad as it sounded, maybe they were just injured. People survive car accidents all the time. He set the photo down on the desk between us, face up, those smiling faces, looking at nothing. Linda had been asking me for months to slow down, said I was working too much, that the kids barely saw me. We'd had a fight that morning about me missing Sarah's soccer game the day before. She said I was building an empire for a family that never got to see me enjoy it. I told her she didn't understand the pressure I was under, the obligations, the responsibilities. I said I was doing it all for them. "You couldn't have known," I said. No, but she was right. I was building something for them, but I wasn't actually with them. I was always going to slow down later, spend more time with them once I'd closed the next deal, once we'd hit the next milestone. There was always one more thing that had to happen first. And then they died, and I realized all those things I'd been chasing didn't matter at all. The only things that mattered were gone. He stood up and walked to the windows, looking out at the city spread below. The lights of Chicago stretched to the horizon, millions of lives being lived in those buildings, millions of stories I'd never know. "The first year was just surviving," Richard continued. "Getting through each day without them, learning to live in a house that felt empty, no matter how much furniture it had. Work was the only thing that made sense, the only place where I still felt competent and in control. So I threw myself into it. Worked 18-hour days, took on bigger projects, more aggressive deals." "The risky investments," I said, understanding clicking into place. "The risky investments. Because safe choices, conservative growth, building something sustainable, all of that reminded me of what I'd lost. Of the future I was supposed to be planning for. College funds and retirement accounts and legacy wealth. What's the point of any of that when there's no one to leave it to? So I started taking bigger swings, chasing deals that excited me, that made me feel something other than grief. The adrenaline of a major acquisition, the thrill of a bold move, it was the only time I felt alive. But it wasn't sustainable. No. Turns out grief is a terrible investment strategy." He laughed, but it was a bitter sound. I kept telling myself I was still building something meaningful, that the risk-taking was strategic, not emotional. But you saw through it in 20 minutes, saw that I was gambling, not investing, chasing feeling instead of returns. I thought about my own losses, different from Richard's, but losses nonetheless. My company, my reputation, my sense of identity. The way I'd spent 2 years feeling like I'd failed everyone who'd ever trusted me. The way work at Murphy's Diner had been both humiliating and oddly necessary, forcing me to find worth in something other than professional success. "I understand," I said. Not the same way, obviously. I didn't lose my family, but I understand what it feels like when the thing you built your whole life around gets taken away. How you question everything, doubt yourself, wonder if anything you did mattered. Richard turned back from the window. "Your son-in-law." My son-in-law. Though technically ex-son-in-law by the time he committed the fraud. "I'm a father," I said. "I understand loving someone so much that losing them or losing their trust breaks something inside you that never quite heals the same way." I pulled out my phone, found a photo of my own. Diane and the kids taken last Christmas at my apartment. Marcus wearing a Santa hat, too big for his head. Zoe holding up a drawing she'd made of our family as superheroes. Diane behind them, arms wrapped around both kids, smiling despite everything she'd been through. My daughter Diane, she's 39 now, works as a nurse at Cook County Hospital. Those are my grandkids, Marcus and Zoe, 7 and 5. Richard looked at the photo. Beautiful family. "They're what kept me alive," I said simply. After Brandon destroyed my company, after the lawsuits and the news coverage and losing everything I'd built, I was standing on Michigan Avenue Bridge one night in December. 2 a.m, freezing cold, looking down at the water, thinking how easy it would be to just step over that railing, how much simpler everything would be if I just wasn't here anymore. I'd never told anyone that before. Not Diane, not my friends, not the therapist the court mandated I see during the investigation. But something about Richard's honesty, his willingness to share his own pain, made me want to offer the same. "What stopped you?" Got a text from Diane. She was working the night shift, sent me a photo of Zoe sleeping in her hospital bed. Diane had brought her to work because she couldn't afford a babysitter, and one of the other nurses had let Zoe sleep in an empty room. The text said, "Dad, I don't know what I'd do without you helping with the kids. You're my rock." And I realized that even though I'd lost my company, even though my reputation was destroyed, I still mattered to someone. I still had a reason to keep going. But your son-in-law, Brandon, he broke something different than what I lost. He broke trust. He broke my faith in my own judgment. I'd welcomed him into my family, into my business. Made him a junior partner because I thought he was smart and capable and worthy of that trust. Turns out I was wrong. And that failure of judgment, that blindness to who he really was, that's haunted me more than the financial losses. I told Richard the full story then, how Diane had married Brandon 8 years ago, young and in love, believing they'd build a life together. How the marriage had started falling apart after 5 years' fights about money and priorities, and Brandon's growing resentment that he wasn't advancing as fast as he thought he deserved. How they'd filed for divorce a year before the fraud investigation, but the paperwork hadn't been finalized, and how Brandon had used that window when he still had access to company accounts, but knew the marriage was over, to steal everything he could before walking away. Diane called me the day Brandon was arrested, I said, crying so hard I could barely understand her. Kept saying she was sorry, that she should have known that if she hadn't married him, none of this would have happened. I told her it wasn't her fault, that Brandon had fooled both of us. But I could hear in her voice that she blamed herself anyway. And knowing that my daughter carried that guilt, that weight, because of a choice I'd supported, that hurt worse than anything the FBI could do to me. Does she still blame herself? Some days more than others. She's raising those 2 kids alone now, working double shifts to make ends meet. Brandon's in federal prison, but she still has to explain to Marcus and Zoe why Daddy isn't around. Why the other kids at school say things about Grandpa being on the news. It's hard, but we're managing. We sat in silence for a while after that, 2 men who'd lost different things but understood the same kind of pain. The kind that doesn't kill you but changes who you are. The kind that teaches you what actually matters when everything else gets stripped away. Richard broke the silence first. "You know what I realized, working with you these past weeks, these numbers we're looking at, these projections and forecasts and strategic plans, they're not just about profit and loss. They're about hope, about the possibility that we can build something that lasts, that matters even after we've lost the people we thought we were building it for." I nodded. That's exactly what the work had become for me. Not just saving Richard's company, but proving to myself that I still had value, that the expertise I'd spent 40 years developing wasn't worthless because one person had exploited my trust, that I could still contribute something meaningful to the world. The recovery continued to exceed our projections. By week 8, revenue was up 12% from when I'd started. The biomedical investments had landed 2 more hospital contracts. The clean energy firms were in negotiations with utility companies for expanded licensing. The software startup had doubled its client base and was generating positive cash flow for the first time. Even some of Webb's allies on the board were starting to come around, admitting the strategy was working, acknowledging that the hard decisions, while painful, had been necessary. The quarterly review had gone well, with clear evidence that Blackstone was on the path to stability. But Webb wasn't finished. The day after the quarterly review, Richard got notice of another emergency board meeting. Ongoing concerns about leadership and strategic direction, scheduled for the following week. The timing wasn't coincidental. Webb was making his move while he still had any credibility to challenge Richard's leadership. "He's running out of time," I told Richard when he showed me the notice. "The company's recovering, which means his narrative about failed leadership is falling apart. He needs to force the issue now before the success becomes undeniable." What's he going to do? Try to reframe the narrative, argue that the gains are fragile or temporary, raise questions about long-term sustainability, create enough doubt that board members get nervous and start questioning whether we're really out of the woods. Can he do that? The numbers are right there. Numbers can be interpreted different ways. And fear is powerful, Richard, even when the facts say otherwise. That night around midnight, Richard called for a car to take me home. As I gathered my papers preparing to leave, he stopped me. "Walter," he said, and there was something in his voice I hadn't heard before. Vulnerability, maybe, or just exhaustion with pretense. "Thank you. Not just for the financial advice, for the strategy for saving my company. Thank you for understanding, for listening, for not judging me when I told you about Linda and the kids. You don't need to thank me for that. I do, though, because you're the first person in 15 years who heard that story and didn't immediately try to fix it or minimize it or tell me it'll get better with time. You just understood, and that matters more than you know." I thought about the bridge, about that December night when I'd been so close to ending everything, about how desperately I'd needed someone to understand what I was feeling without trying to solve it or make it better. Just to witness it, to acknowledge it, to say, yes, this is hard, and it's okay that it's hard. "We're not done yet," I said. "We still have a company to save, and something tells me Webb isn't finished with us. This emergency board meeting, that's not just about questioning strategy. That's about him making his play, whatever it is." "I know, and I'm ready for it. Because of you. Because you showed me that losing everything and starting over doesn't mean you're finished. It means you get to decide who you want to be next, what you want to build next. And I want to build something that would have made Linda proud, something Michael and Sarah would have been excited to be part of. Not the biggest empire or the flashiest deals, just something solid and good and sustainable." "Then that's what we'll build," I said. "Together. But first we have to get through Leonard Webb, and I have a feeling that meeting next week is going to be unlike anything we've faced so far." Richard nodded. "Whatever happens, Walter, I want you to know that bringing you in was the best decision I've made in years, not just professionally, personally. You reminded me what actually matters." "Same to you," I said, and meant it, because somewhere in the process of saving Richard's company, I'd started saving myself too. Started believing again that I had something to offer, that expertise and experience and wisdom still counted for something regardless of where you'd fallen from or how far you had to climb back up. The car arrived and I headed home knowing that the real test was still ahead of us. Webb was planning something, and we'd need to be ready. The moment I'd been dreading arrived on a Tuesday morning in early April. I was in the conference room reviewing quarterly projections, comparing our actual performance against the forecasts I'd made 8 weeks ago. The numbers looked good, better than good. We were ahead of schedule on almost every metric. Revenue up, debt down, cash reserves rebuilding. The kind of progress that should have made me feel confident about the emergency board meeting scheduled for the next day. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, that Webb had one more card to play. Then James burst into the room, his face pale, moving faster than I'd ever seen him move. "Mr. Davis," he said, his voice tight with something between panic and confusion. "There are FBI agents in the lobby. They're asking for you." The room tilted slightly. My hands, which had been steady while holding my coffee cup, started to shake. FBI. After 2 years, I'd thought the investigations were finally over. Thought I'd put that nightmare behind me. Brandon was in prison. The civil suits had been settled. My name had been cleared officially, legally, completely. But apparently not completely enough. "Do they have a warrant?" I asked, my voice calmer than I felt. Old habits from 2 years ago. Always ask about the warrant first. "I don't know. Mr. Blackstone is handling it right now, but they're insisting on speaking with you specifically. They asked for you by name." My mind raced through possibilities. Someone must have connected Walter Davis, the consultant, with Walter Davis from the fraud scandal. Maybe a journalist doing background research. Maybe a board member who'd gotten suspicious. Maybe Webb himself digging into my past, finding ammunition to use against Richard. "Where are they?" "Mr. Blackstone's office. He said to bring you there immediately." I stood up, gathering the papers I'd been working on more out of habit than necessity. My hands were still shaking after 2 years of rebuilding, of finding purpose again, of proving I still had value. Was it all about to collapse again? Was this going to be another media circus, another round of accusations and implications and assumptions about guilt? I walked to Richard's office with James beside me, each step feeling heavier than the last. Through the glass walls, I could see Richard standing behind his desk, looking tense, and 2 people in dark suits facing him. Federal agents. The nightmare was back. When I entered Richard's office, the 2 agents turned to face me. The first was a Hispanic man in his early 40s, built solid with sharp eyes that took in everything about me in a single glance. The second was an Asian American woman, maybe mid-30s, with a tablet in her hands and an expression of professional neutrality that gave away nothing. "Mr. Davis," the male agent said. "I'm Agent Rodriguez. This is Agent Chen. We're with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. We need to discuss your involvement in an ongoing investigation." "What investigation?" I asked, my voice steadier than my hands. "I was fully cleared 2 years ago. The case against my son-in-law is closed. He's serving his sentence." "This isn't about that case," Agent Chen said. "At least not directly. We're investigating a conspiracy that extends far beyond your former son-in-law's actions. We believe you may have information relevant to our investigation. Information you're not even aware you possess." I exchanged a glance with Richard. He looked as confused as I felt. "What kind of conspiracy?" Richard asked. "Corporate espionage and financial fraud," Agent Rodriguez said. "Specifically, a pattern of deliberate corporate sabotage designed to acquire companies and client lists at distressed prices. We've been investigating this operation for 8 months now. It involves multiple firms, multiple victims, and a coordinated effort to destabilize and acquire financial services companies." The words hit me like cold water. Multiple firms. A pattern. Corporate sabotage. This wasn't about Brandon acting alone. This was something bigger. "I don't understand," I said. "What does this have to do with me?" "Everything, Mr. Davis." Agent Chen pulled up something on her tablet, then turned it to face me. "We believe your company, Davis and Partners, was specifically targeted for destruction, that the fraud committed by Brandon Mitchell wasn't opportunistic or random. It was orchestrated as part of a larger scheme to acquire your client list and assets." The room seemed to tilt again, but different this time. Not fear, but a kind of dizzying reorientation as everything I thought I understood shifted into a new pattern. "Targeted," I said slowly. "You're saying someone deliberately set up Brandon to destroy my company?" "Not set him up exactly," Agent Rodriguez said. "Your son-in-law was a willing participant, but he didn't act alone and he wasn't the architect of the plan. Someone approached him, provided specific instructions, offered financial incentives, someone who knew exactly what they were doing and had done it before." Richard's face had gone pale. "You're saying there's someone out there who specializes in destroying financial firms?" "Among other things, yes," Agent Chen said, "which is why we're here, because we believe that person is connected to Blackstone Enterprises, and we think Mr. Davis might be able to help us prove it." "Brandon has been cooperating with our investigation for the past 3 months," Agent Rodriguez said. "Initially, he refused to provide any information beyond what was directly related to his own charges. But when we showed him evidence that he'd been part of a larger pattern, evidence that other people had been manipulated the same way he was, he agreed to tell us everything." Agent Chen pulled up a document on her tablet. According to Brandon's statement, he was approached approximately 3 years ago. This was during a period when he and your daughter were experiencing significant financial difficulties. He'd lost his job, they had substantial credit card debt, and he was feeling desperate and humiliated. I remembered that time. Diane had asked me for a loan, which I'd given her without hesitation. $20,000 to help them get back on their feet. I'd thought the money troubles were temporary, a rough patch most young couples go through. I hadn't realized how deep the problems went or how vulnerable Brandon felt. Someone contacted him, Agent Rodriguez continued. Claimed to be a business consultant who'd heard Brandon was unhappy in his position at Davis & Partners. Suggested there might be opportunities for someone willing to take certain risks. The initial conversation was vague, feeling Brandon out, seeing if he'd be receptive. Who was this person? Richard asked. We're getting to that. The consultant, as he called himself, met with Brandon several times over the course of about 6 months. Always in public places, restaurants, or coffee shops. Nothing that would raise suspicion. During these meetings, he gradually revealed what he wanted Brandon would use his access to Davis & Partners accounts to move client funds in a way that would appear to be embezzlement. The goal was to create a scandal large enough to destroy the firm's reputation and force it into bankruptcy. My stomach turned. Brandon knew from the beginning this was designed to destroy my company. According to his statement, yes, though the consultant presented it as a victimless crime. He told Brandon the clients would be compensated through insurance and legal settlements, that no one would actually lose money in the long term, that the only real victim would be the company itself, which would be acquired by investors who specialized in distressed assets. And Brandon believed that. I couldn't keep the anger out of my voice. He wanted to believe it, Agent Chen said, because the consultant offered him $500,000, half up front, half after the fraud was discovered and the company collapsed. For a man who was drowning in debt and feeling like a failure, that was life-changing money, so he chose to believe that what he was doing wouldn't really hurt anyone. Except it did, I said. It hurt everyone. My clients lost their savings, some of them lost their homes, their retirement plans got destroyed, and my reputation, my business, everything I'd built over 40 years gone. We know, Agent Rodriguez said quietly. Brandon knows too now. It's part of why he's cooperating. He's realized the consultant lied to him about everything. The clients weren't compensated. The insurance companies fought the claims. People's lives were ruined. And the consultant, whoever he really was, never paid the second half of the money. Just disappeared once the fraud was discovered. So Brandon committed a felony, destroyed multiple lives, including his own family, all for $250,000 that he thought was going to be $500,000. Yes, which is why we believe he was manipulated, not just corrupt. Someone identified him as vulnerable, isolated him from support systems, convinced him this was his only way out, then provided specific instructions designed to maximize damage to your company while appearing to be amateur hour embezzlement. Richard leaned forward. You said this person gave Brandon instructions on how to make it look like a family business gone wrong. Why? Because that narrative serves multiple purposes, Agent Chen explained. First, it creates maximum reputational damage. A stranger stealing from a company is just theft. A family member stealing makes it personal, makes it look like there were fundamental problems with judgment and trust within the organization. Second, it makes investigators focus on the family dynamics, rather than looking for outside conspirators. And third, it creates the kind of scandal that makes other clients nervous and makes the firm impossible to sell as a going concern, which means the assets get liquidated at fire sale prices. I said, the pattern becoming clear. Exactly. And someone is there to buy them. Client lists, intellectual property, even physical assets, all at a fraction of what they'd cost on the open market. Richard had been standing very still, processing everything. Now he asked the question I was afraid to voice. Who is this consultant? This person who approached Brandon? Agent Rodriguez and Agent Chen exchanged a look. Then Rodriguez pulled a photograph from his folder and placed it on Richard's desk. Do either of you recognize this man? I leaned forward to look. The photo showed two men sitting across from each other in what appeared to be a restaurant. One was younger, recognizable even though the angle wasn't perfect. Brandon. The other was older, well-dressed with silver hair and the kind of face that projected authority and respectability. My blood turned to ice. That's Leonard Webb, I said. He's on Blackstone's board of directors. Richard made a sound like he'd been punched. He picked up the photograph, staring at it like he could change what it showed through sheer force of will. Leonard, you're saying Leonard Webb orchestrated the fraud that destroyed Walter's company? We've had Mr. Webb under surveillance for 6 months, Agent Chen said. We believe he's been using this method to acquire multiple companies over the past decade. The pattern is always the same. Identify a successful firm, usually minority-owned or operated, that has valuable assets or client lists. Find someone inside the organization who's vulnerable, financially desperate, or personally troubled. Manipulate them into committing fraud or sabotage. Let the scandal destroy the company. Then acquire the pieces for pennies on the dollar. How many companies? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. We've identified at least 7 over the past 12 years. Yours was one of them. The others include 2 law firms, a consulting company, an investment fund, and 2 smaller financial services firms. Total damages estimated at over $400 million. Total amount Webb has profited from acquiring distressed assets approximately $1.2 billion. The numbers were staggering. This wasn't just about me. This wasn't just about Brandon's betrayal or my destroyed reputation. This was a systematic operation spanning more than a decade, destroying lives and livelihoods so one man could get richer. Why target minority-owned firms specifically? Richard asked. Multiple reasons, Agent Rodriguez said. First, they often have fewer resources to defend against prolonged legal battles or media scrutiny. Second, there's a built-in narrative that plays into existing biases. Fraud at a minority-owned firm gets more sensational coverage, more suspicious scrutiny. Third, and this is particularly cynical, minority business owners are less likely to have the kind of social and professional networks that can help them recover from a scandal. The damage tends to be more permanent. I thought about my own experience. How some clients had immediately assumed I must have known about the fraud. How harder it had been to find support in the financial community. How many doors had closed that might have stayed open for someone with different skin color and different connections. And Blackstone, Richard's voice was tight. Is Webb trying to do the same thing here? We believe so, yes. The pattern matches his previous operations almost exactly. Join the board of a successful company. Begin questioning leadership decisions, creating atmosphere of instability. Meanwhile, acquire shares, quietly positioning yourself to profit from the chaos. The goal is either to force the CEO out and take control yourself, or to drive the company into such crisis that you can acquire it at distressed prices. Richard walked to the windows, his back to us. I could see his shoulders rigid with tension. How long have you known about this? We've suspected Webb's involvement with Blackstone for about 3 months, Agent Chen said. But we couldn't prove it until Brandon provided testimony linking him directly to the Davis & Partners fraud. That gave us probable cause to expand our surveillance and investigation. And what we've found suggests Webb is in the final stages of his operation here, the emergency board meeting he's called for tomorrow. We believe that's when he plans to make his move. What kind of move? I asked. Most likely a vote of no confidence in Richard's leadership, possibly coupled with a buyout offer that he's prepared in advance. He'll frame it as saving the company from continued instability. Some board members, especially those he's been cultivating relationships with, will support him. And if he gets enough votes, he either takes control of Blackstone or forces a sale that nets him hundreds of millions in profit. Richard turned back from the window, his face hard. That's why he's been fighting every decision, every sale, every restructuring move. Not because he thought they were wrong, but because he needed the company to look unstable. He needed me to look like a failing CEO so his takeover would seem reasonable. Exactly, Agent Rodriguez confirmed. But here's where things got complicated for Webb. He didn't anticipate you hiring Walter. Didn't anticipate that someone with Walter's expertise would spot the financial problems and fix them quickly. The company is recovering, which undermines his entire narrative about failing leadership. So he's running out of time, I said, which makes him desperate, which makes him dangerous. That's why we're here, Agent Chen said. We have enough evidence to arrest Webb for his role in the Davis & Partners fraud, but we want to catch him in the act of attempting the same scheme with Blackstone. It'll strengthen our case significantly and potentially help us identify other co-conspirators or victims we haven't found yet. Richard crossed his arms. What are you proposing? We need you both to attend tomorrow's board meeting as planned, Agent Rodriguez said. Mr. Davis, we'd like you to wear a wire. We need to get Webb on record making statements about his takeover plans, his manipulation of the board, anything that demonstrates his intent to defraud Blackstone Enterprises and its shareholders. A wire? I thought about the last time I'd been involved with an FBI investigation. The interrogations, the depositions, the feeling of being under constant scrutiny. You want me to go into a board meeting with Leonard Webb, who destroyed my company, and try to get him to confess while wearing a wire? We understand it's asking a lot, Agent Chen said. But you're in a unique position. Webb doesn't know that we've connected him to the Davis fraud. He doesn't know Brandon has been cooperating. As far as he's concerned, you're just the consultant Richard hired. He might say things in front of you that he wouldn't say if he knew you could connect him to what happened to your company. Richard looked at me. Walter, this is your call. I won't ask you to do this if you're not comfortable. We can find another way. I thought about the past 2 years, working as a waiter at 71 years old, watching my daughter struggle to support her kids alone, living in a studio apartment on the South Side, all because Leonard Webb had decided my company was worth more to him destroyed than thriving. Because he'd manipulated Brandon, exploited Diane's marriage troubles, ruined dozens of lives for profit, and now he was trying to do it again. To Richard, who'd given me a chance when nobody else would, to Blackstone Enterprises and all the people who worked there, to more families who'd end up like mine, broken and struggling and wondering what they'd done to deserve it. I'll do it, I said. Not just for you, Richard, for every company Webb has destroyed, for every person whose life he's ruined for profit, for my daughter and my grandkids who had to suffer because of his greed. I'll wear the wire. I'll get you what you need. Agent Rodriguez nodded respect in his eyes. We'll prep you this afternoon. The wire is virtually undetectable, and we'll have agents positioned nearby in case anything goes wrong. All you need to do is attend the meeting normally. If Webb makes his move like we expect, let him talk. The more he says, the stronger our case. What if he doesn't say anything incriminating? Richard asked. What if he's careful? Then we arrest him based on the Davis and Partners evidence, Agent Chen said. It's enough for charges, though a jury trial could be complicated. But if we can catch him attempting the same fraud again on record, it becomes a pattern. Multiple victims, systematic operation, much harder to defend against. When do we start? I asked. Right now, Agent Rodriguez said. We have a lot of preparation to do before tomorrow's board meeting, and we need to make sure you're ready for whatever Webb throws at you, because make no mistake, Mr. Davis, tomorrow is going to be unlike anything you've experienced, and we need you to be perfect. I thought about Murphy's Diner, about serving eggs to customers who saw me as invisible, about the bridge on Michigan Avenue and how close I'd come to giving up, about Diane's text that saved my life. I'm ready, I said. Let's take this son of a bitch down. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. I arrived at Blackstone Tower at 1:30, giving myself time to settle my nerves before walking into what would either be justice or disaster. The wire Agent Rodriguez had fitted that morning sat against my chest like a weight, a small piece of technology that felt heavier than it should have. A constant reminder of what I was about to do. Testing, Mr. Davis. Agent Rodriguez's voice came through the tiny earpiece hidden in my left ear. Can you hear me clearly? I touched my tie, the signal we'd agreed on for yes. Good. Remember, just act natural. Let Webb do the talking. If he makes his move like we expect, let him build his case. The more he says, the better. We have agents positioned in the building, in the lobby, on the floor below. You're completely safe. Just get us what we need. The conference room was already filling up when I entered at 1:50. Board members taking their usual seats, several of them talking in low voices, the tension in the room palpable. They knew something significant was about to happen. Webb had made sure of that with his emergency meeting notice and his carefully worded concerns about leadership and strategic direction. Webb himself arrived at 1:55, flanked by 3 board members I'd identified as his closest allies. He looked confident, almost relaxed, like a man who'd already won and was just here to collect his prize. Designer suit, perfectly knotted tie, an expression that projected concern for the company rather than personal ambition. He'd played this role before, destroyed companies before. This was just another day's work for him. He caught my eye as he took his seat at the head of the table and gave me a slight nod, polite acknowledgement. Nothing more. He had no idea who I really was to him, no idea that the consultant Richard had hired to save Blackstone was the same man whose company he'd destroyed 3 years ago. No idea that every word he was about to say would be recorded and used to put him in prison. Richard sat to Webb's left, his face carefully neutral. We'd prepared for this, knew what was coming, but knowing didn't make it easier. The wire felt like it was burning against my skin. At exactly 2 p.m., Webb called the meeting to order. Thank you all for making time on short notice. Webb began, his voice carrying that tone of grave concern that politicians and con men perfect over years of practice. I know we've all been monitoring the restructuring efforts over the past 2 months. And while there have been some positive indicators, I believe we need to have a frank conversation about the ongoing instability of this company and the leadership decisions that brought us to this point. He pulled up a presentation on the screen. Graphs, charts, data that looked impressive until you examined it closely. I recognized the technique. Take real numbers, frame them in the worst possible light. Create a narrative of crisis that justified drastic action. As you can see, Webb continued, while we've shown some revenue improvement, the costs of the restructuring have been enormous. The Miami sale alone cost us $200 million in losses. The subsidiary liquidations cost another $150 million. We've essentially destroyed a third of the company's value in just 8 weeks. One of the board members raised a hand. But Leonard, those were necessary cuts. The Miami project was bleeding money. The subsidiaries were cash flow negative. We had to stop the hemorrhaging. Did we? Webb's eyebrow raised slightly. Or did we panic? Did we make hasty decisions based on the advice of an outside consultant who appeared out of nowhere and convinced our CEO to dismantle everything we'd built? These weren't failing investments. They were long-term plays that needed time to mature. And we sold them at fire sale prices because someone told us the sky was falling. He clicked to the next slide. My credentials, or rather a very selective version of them. Let's talk about Davis Strategic Consulting. Walter Davis, our mysterious savior who showed up 2 months ago with dire warnings and aggressive restructuring plans. What do we actually know about him? Several board members shifted uncomfortably. This was the attack I'd been expecting, the one Agent Rodriguez had prepared me for. Webb was going to question my credibility, my expertise, my past. He was going to make the board doubt everything we'd accomplished. Davis & Partners Financial Consulting, Webb said, letting the name hang in the air. Anyone remember that firm? It was all over the news about 3 years ago. Embezzlement scandal, fraud investigation, FBI raids. The owner's son-in-law stole millions from clients. The company collapsed. The owner lost everything. He turned to look directly at me. That owner was Walter Davis, the same man Richard brought in to save this company. A man whose own business was destroyed by fraud, who ended up working as a waiter before Richard found him, who has spent the past 2 months convincing us to sell our assets and dismantle our growth strategy. The room went silent. Several board members looked at me with new expressions. Surprise, concern, suspicion, exactly what Webb wanted. Now, I'm not saying Mr. Davis was complicit in the fraud at his own firm. Webb continued, his tone carefully reasonable. The FBI cleared him of criminal wrongdoing. But we have to ask ourselves, what kind of judgment does it show that his own family member could steal millions under his nose? What kind of expertise are we trusting when the expert couldn't even protect his own company? Furthermore, Webb clicked to another slide showing stock prices. While Mr. Davis has been restructuring Blackstone, our stock price has dropped 18%. Investor confidence is at a 5-year low. Major clients are asking questions about our stability. The market sees what we're doing and they don't like it. They see a company in crisis, not a company being saved. He paused, letting that sink in. Which brings me to the real question we need to address today. Is Richard Blackstone still capable of leading this company? He brought in a consultant with a questionable background. He's liquidated billions in assets based on that consultant's advice. He's created an atmosphere of instability that's driving down our value. And when board members like myself raise legitimate concerns, we're dismissed as obstructionist. Webb's voice hardened. I believe we need new leadership. I believe Richard has lost the confidence of this board and the confidence of our investors. And I believe continuing down this path will destroy everything Blackstone Enterprises has built over the past 20 years. Webb sat down, the challenge issued. Several of his allies nodded in agreement. A few other board members looked uncertain, swayed by the presentation, by the framing, by the doubt Webb had so skillfully planted. Richard started to stand to defend himself, but I touched his arm, shook my head slightly. This one was mine. I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of the wire against my chest, hearing Agent Rodriguez's voice in my earpiece. Perfect. Let him respond. Get him talking. Mr. Webb, I said, my voice steady and clear. Those are serious accusations, but they're not supported by the actual data. Let me show you what the numbers really say. I pulled up my own presentation on the tablet, overriding Webb's slides. Revenue charts that showed clear upward trajectory. Debt reduction that was ahead of schedule. profitable investments that were exceeding projections. The real story, not Webb's selective interpretation. Blackstone Enterprises has improved consistently over the past 8 weeks. Revenue is up 12% from when I started. Debt payments are being made on schedule with surplus to rebuild cash reserves. The investments we've focused on, the biomedical companies, the clean energy firms, the software startups, are all growing faster than projected. I clicked through the slides, letting the numbers speak. Yes, we took losses on Miami, but that project was consuming $3 million per quarter with no revenue and years until potential return. It was a sinking ship and we got off it. Yes, we liquidated subsidiaries, but those subsidiaries were cash flow negative. They were draining resources we needed for investments that actually work. Several board members leaned forward, studying the data. I could see the uncertainty on their faces shifting. Webb's narrative was compelling, but numbers don't lie if you present them honestly. As for the stock price, I continued, it's dropped because the market doesn't like uncertainty. They see restructuring and they get nervous. But if you look at analyst reports from the past 2 weeks, the narrative is changing. They're starting to see that Blackstone is making hard but smart decisions. The stock price will recover as the results become undeniable. I turned to face Webb directly. And yes, let's talk about my background. My firm was destroyed by fraud, but not because I was incompetent or complicit, because I was targeted. My son-in-law was manipulated into committing crimes that destroyed my company. The FBI investigation cleared me completely. And the expertise I'd developed over 40 years didn't disappear because one person betrayed my trust. Webb's face had darkened, but he kept his composure. A touching story, Mr. Davis, but it doesn't change the facts. This company is less stable now than it was 2 months ago, and Richard's decision to stake everything on the advice of a disgraced consultant shows fundamentally poor judgment. Disgraced, I felt anger rising in my chest, fought to keep my voice level. I was a victim of fraud, not a perpetrator. There's a significant difference. Unless you're suggesting that being targeted by criminals somehow invalidates decades of expertise. I'm suggesting, Webb said, his voice taking on an edge, that this board needs to seriously consider whether our current leadership has the judgment and stability to guide this company forward. We've lost billions in value. We've dismantled major projects. We've created uncertainty in the market. And for what? Some modest improvements in cash flow, some small gains in revenue. That's not leadership, that's damage control after a series of catastrophic mistakes. He stood up, commanding the room. I'm calling for a vote of no confidence in Richard Blackstone's leadership. I believe it's time for new direction. I believe this board needs to take control of this situation before we lose everything. And I believe the first step is removing Richard as CEO and installing leadership that will stabilize this company rather than continue down this destructive path. The room erupted in voices, some board members objecting, some agreeing, everyone talking over each other. This was the moment. Webb's play, the takeover attempt we'd been expecting. Richard's face had gone pale, but he remained seated, letting it play out. Trusting me, trusting the FBI, trusting that this was all part of the plan. Webb raised his voice over the chaos. I have a proposal ready. A comprehensive restructuring plan that will restore investor confidence and put Blackstone back on stable footing. It includes a change in executive leadership and a strategic refocus on the core investments that made this company successful. I'm prepared to present it now if the board is willing to hear it. Before you do that, I said, my voice cutting through the noise, I think everyone in this room needs to know exactly who you are, Leonard, and what you've really been doing. Webb looked at me with an expression of carefully controlled irritation. Excuse me? My name is Walter Davis, I said, standing up straighter, feeling the wire against my chest, knowing every word was being recorded. I was senior partner at Davis & Partners Financial Consulting for 40 years. I managed portfolios worth over $50 million. My clients trusted me with their life savings, their retirement funds, their children's futures. I walked slowly around the table, my eyes locked on Webb. 3 years ago, my son-in-law Brandon Mitchell committed fraud that destroyed my company. He forged my signature, moved client funds, created exactly the kind of scandal that makes a financial consulting firm impossible to recover from. The FBI investigated me for 8 months. I lost my business, my reputation, my savings. I ended up working as a waiter at a diner just to survive. Several board members were watching me intently now. Even Webb's allies seemed confused about where this was going. What I didn't know until yesterday, I continued, was that the fraud wasn't random. It wasn't just my son-in-law making bad decisions. He was approached 3 years ago by someone who offered him money to destroy my company. Someone who gave him specific instructions on how to make it look like amateur embezzlement while maximizing reputational damage. Someone who wanted Davis and Partners destroyed so he could acquire the client lists and assets at fire sale prices. Webb's face had lost some of its color. This is absurd. What does this have to do with Blackstone? Everything, I said. Because that someone was you, Leonard. You approached Brandon, you manipulated him, you orchestrated the fraud that destroyed my company. And you've done it before. Multiple times. It's your business model. Find successful companies, usually minority-owned, identify someone vulnerable inside the organization, manipulate them into committing fraud, then acquire the pieces when everything collapses. The room was completely silent now, every eye moving between me and Webb. That's a serious accusation, Webb said, his voice tight. And completely unfounded. I've never met your son-in-law. I had nothing to do with what happened to your company. This sounds like a desperate attempt to deflect from your own failures. The FBI has photographs of you meeting with Brandon Mitchell, I said. Multiple meetings over 6 months. They have his testimony about exactly what you told him to do and how much you paid him. They have financial records showing your pattern of acquiring distressed assets from companies that collapsed under suspicious circumstances. They have 8 months of surveillance on you, Leonard. And they have recordings of everything you've said in this room today. Webb's eyes widened slightly. A crack in the perfect composure. Recordings. I pulled out the wire from under my shirt, the small microphone visible now. I've been wearing a wire this entire meeting. Every word you've said about taking over this company, about Richard's poor judgment, about me being a disgraced consultant, it's all been recorded. And you know what else the FBI knows you're trying to do to Blackstone, exactly what you did to my company. Create instability, undermine leadership, position yourself to profit from the chaos. This is entrapment, Webb said, but his voice had lost its confidence. He was looking around the room now, seeing the expressions on the other board members' faces. Shock, anger, betrayal. It's not entrapment when you're voluntarily committing crimes, I said. You called this meeting. You launched this attack on Richard's leadership. You presented your takeover plan. Nobody forced you to do any of it. We just gave you the opportunity to show everyone exactly who you are. Webb's face cycled through several expressions. Disbelief, anger, fear, finally landing on something cold and calculating. You have no proof of anything. Brandon Mitchell is a convicted felon. His testimony is worthless, and wearing a wire to a board meeting doesn't prove I destroyed your company. It proves you're paranoid and vindictive. Actually, I said, it proves you're exactly as dangerous as the FBI thinks you are. Because a smart man, an innocent man, would be outraged by these accusations, would immediately deny any knowledge of Brandon Mitchell, would call his lawyer and refuse to say another word. But you're still trying to talk your way out of this, still trying to control the narrative. Because that's what you do. You manipulate situations, manipulate people, turn everything to your advantage, except this time, Leonard, you don't have the advantage anymore. Is there something you'd like to tell us about your relationship with Brandon Mitchell? I asked, knowing Agent Rodriguez was listening to every word. About the meetings you had with him 3 years ago, about the specific instructions you gave him for destroying Davis and Partners. Webb's jaw clenched. I don't have to explain myself to you. You're a disgraced consultant with an axe to grind. This entire performance is pathetic. You don't have to explain yourself to me, I agreed. But you might want to explain yourself to them. I nodded toward the conference room doors. On cue, they opened. Agent Rodriguez and Agent Chen walked in, flanked by 4 other federal agents in FBI windbreakers. The board members gasped, several of them standing up, backing away from the table. Leonard Webb, Agent Rodriguez said, his voice carrying the full authority of the federal government. You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, corporate espionage, racketeering, and attempted extortion. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Webb stood frozen for a moment, his face the color of old newspaper. Then he tried to run. Physically tried to run for the back door of the conference room. One of the agents caught him before he made it 3 steps, pulling his arms behind his back, snapping handcuffs onto his wrists. This is insane! Webb shouted, his composure completely shattered now. You can't arrest me. I'm a board member. I'm on the board of 3 Fortune 500 companies. Do you know who I am? We know exactly who you are, Agent Chen said calmly. We've been investigating you for 8 months. We have testimony from Brandon Mitchell. We have financial records showing your acquisition of assets from companies that collapsed under suspicious circumstances. We have surveillance footage. We have recorded conversations. And thanks to Mr. Davis, we now have you on tape attempting to execute the exact same scheme on Blackstone Enterprises that you used on 7 other companies. This is entrapment. This is a setup. My lawyers will destroy you. Agent Rodriguez finished reading. Webb, his rights, then nodded to the other agents. They began escorting him out of the conference room, Webb still shouting about his lawyers and his connections and how this was all a mistake. The other board members sat in stunned silence, watching the man who'd been their chairman, their colleague, their trusted advisor get led away in handcuffs. Some looked shocked, others looked angry. A few looked scared, probably wondering if they'd unknowingly been part of Webb's schemes. One of Webb's allies, a board member who'd been nodding along with everything Webb said 10 minutes ago, stood up shakily. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know what he was doing. He told me he was concerned about the company. He showed me data. I thought we were just trying to help. We'll need statements from everyone, Agent Chen said. But for now, this meeting is over. Board members, please remain in the building. We have agents who will need to speak with each of you individually. As the FBI agents began organizing the board members, Richard and I stood by the windows watching the chaos unfold. The view of Chicago stretched out below us, the city going about its business, unaware that in this room, justice had finally caught up with a man who'd been destroying lives for over a decade. After the last board member had been escorted out for questioning after Agent Rodriguez had retrieved the wire and thanked me for my cooperation, after the building had finally started to quiet down, Richard and I stood alone in the conference room, just the two of us and the city beyond the windows. The recording got everything, I said quietly. Webb admitting his concerns about my credentials, his attack on your leadership, his proposal to take over the company. Combined with Brandon's testimony and the surveillance evidence, the FBI says they have enough to put him away for 20 years minimum. 20 years, Richard repeated, for destroying how many lives, how many companies? At least 7 they can prove. Probably more they haven't found yet. Total damages over $400 million. Total profit to Webb over $1 billion. He's been running this scheme for 12 years, Richard. 12 years of systematically destroying businesses and livelihoods so he could get richer. Richard walked to the windows, pressed his forehead against the cool glass. He was on my board for 3 years. 3 years, and I never suspected. Never saw what he was really doing. How did I miss it? Because he's good at what he does. He's had over a decade to perfect the technique. How to join boards, how to build trust, how to identify weaknesses, how to strike at exactly the right moment. You didn't miss anything. He was just that skilled at hiding who he really was. Until you stopped him. Until we stopped him, I corrected. You gave me the platform to do it. You trusted me when you had no reason to. You stood by the strategy even when Webb was attacking it. This was teamwork, Richard. Neither of us could have done it alone. He turned from the window and I saw tears in his eyes. When Linda died, when I lost the kids, I thought that was the worst thing that could happen to me. I thought I'd never feel that kind of pain again. But finding out that someone I trusted, someone I worked with for 3 years, was planning to destroy everything I'd built, that feels almost as bad. But he didn't destroy it, I said. That's the difference. He tried, he came close, but he didn't succeed. Because we saw what he was doing. We fought back. We stopped him. What happens now? Richard asked. Now we rebuild. Your company, my reputation, everything Webb tried to destroy. We build it back better than it was before. We prove that people like him don't win in the end. We show that truth and justice and hard work still matter. Richard nodded slowly. Together. Together, I agreed. Because that's what he never understood. Webb thought power was about manipulation and exploitation. About using people and discarding them. But real power comes from partnership, from trust, from building something with people who believe in the same things you do. And that's something he could never take from us. 2 months after Leonard Webb's arrest, Blackstone Enterprises was thriving in ways even I hadn't projected. The board had unanimously voted to make me Chief Strategy Officer, a permanent position with equity and a salary that made my old consulting fees look modest. Davis Strategic Consulting had a waiting list of companies seeking turnaround expertise, more business than I could handle even if I worked around the clock. The biomedical investments had landed 6 major hospital contracts generating $12 million in quarterly revenue. The clean energy firms had expanded their patent licensing to utility companies across the Midwest, bringing in consistent royalty payments. The software startup had gone from 15 manufacturing clients to over 60, and was being courted by larger tech companies for potential acquisition at valuations that would net Blackstone significant returns. Revenue was up 38% from my first day. Debt had been reduced by 42%. Cash reserves were rebuilding faster than projected. The stock price, which had dropped during the restructuring, had recovered and was now trading 15% above where it had been when I started. Analyst reports praised Blackstone's disciplined approach and strategic refocusing. Investor confidence was at a 5-year high. But the best news came from an unexpected source. The insurance companies that had initially fought the claims from Webb's fraud schemes had reversed course once the FBI evidence became public. They'd agreed to settlements that would compensate victims of all 7 companies Webb had destroyed, including mine. My former clients would get back most of what they'd lost. Not everything, not the years of stress and uncertainty, but enough to rebuild their retirement plans and restore some of what had been stolen. I'd moved out of my studio apartment into a 2-bedroom condo in Hyde Park. Nothing extravagant but comfortable. A place where Marcus and Zoe could have their own room when they stayed over. Where Diane could visit without feeling like she was intruding on a space barely large enough for one person. Richard and I had formed a genuine friendship. Not just business partners, but 2 men who understood each other's pain, who'd saved each other in different ways. He'd started dating again, something he hadn't done since Linda's death. Small steps toward building a life that honored his past without being trapped by it. Tommy Murphy had called me a month after the arrest made the news. Told me my spot at Murphy's Diner would always be there if I wanted to come back, not as a waiter, but as a friend. I'd gone back twice just for coffee, just to remember where I'd been and how far I'd come. Everything was finally moving in the right direction. The nightmare was over. Or so I thought. On a Tuesday evening in late June, I was at home reviewing proposals from potential clients when my phone rang. Unknown number, but with a Chicago area code. I almost didn't answer, assuming it was a telemarketer or wrong number. Mr. Davis, this is Agent Rodriguez from the FBI. My stomach dropped. After 2 months of quiet, of normalcy, of feeling like the worst was behind me, hearing that voice brought everything back. Is something wrong? Is it about Webb's case? No, the case is solid. Webb's lawyer is trying to negotiate a plea deal, but we're not offering one. He's going to trial and he's going to prison. This is about something else, something more personal. I sat down, gripping the phone tighter. What is it? Brandon Mitchell has been cooperating extensively with our investigation. He's provided testimony not just about Webb, but about the entire operation. Names, dates, bank accounts, other victims we hadn't identified. His cooperation is why we were able to build such a comprehensive case. Okay, I said slowly, not sure where this was going. He's asked to see you. Multiple times over the past month. Says there are things he needs to tell you in person. Things he needs to explain about what happened and why. I've been holding off on passing along the request because I wasn't sure it was appropriate. But he's been persistent. Says he can't move forward until he talks to you. I was quiet for a long moment, processing. Brandon wanted to see me. The man who'd destroyed my company, who'd stolen from my clients, who'd exploited my family relationship to commit fraud. The man whose actions had led to me standing on that bridge in December, contemplating whether life was worth continuing. Does Diane know about this? I asked. No. We wanted you to decide first whether you're willing to meet with him. If you say no, we never mention it to anyone. If you say yes, then we can discuss whether to tell your daughter. What would I be agreeing to? Where would this meeting happen? At our field office, supervised meeting room. Brandon is in federal custody pending sentencing. He's looking at 3 to 5 years with his cooperation. The meeting would be completely voluntary on your part. You can leave at any time. You can refuse to answer any questions. This is entirely your choice. I thought about Diane, about Marcus and Zoe, about the 2 years of hell we'd all been through. I need to think about it. Take your time, Mr. Davis. This is Brandon's request, not ours. But I will say this. In my 20 years with the Bureau, I've seen a lot of criminals. Some are sociopaths who feel nothing. Some are opportunists who do it again in a heartbeat. And some are people who made terrible choices and genuinely regret them. Brandon falls into that third category. Whether that matters to you is your decision. 3 days later, I walked into the FBI field office on West Roosevelt Road. Agent Rodriguez met me in the lobby, led me through security down a hallway that smelled like industrial cleaner and old coffee. We stopped outside a door marked Interview Room 3. "He's inside," Rodriguez said. "I'll be watching from the observation room. If you need anything, just signal toward the mirror. If you want to leave, just stand up and walk out. There's no obligation for you to stay." I nodded, my mouth dry. My hands were shaking slightly. I'd faced down Leonard Webb in a boardroom full of people. I'd worn a wire and helped the FBI build their case. But somehow this felt harder, more personal, more real. Rodriguez opened the door. I stepped inside. Brandon Mitchell sat at a metal table, his hands cuffed in front of him, wearing an orange jumpsuit that hung loose on his frame. He'd lost weight, maybe 20 pounds. His face was gaunt, covered in patchy stubble like he'd given up on shaving consistently. His eyes were red-rimmed and hollow. He looked 10 years older than his 35 years. When he saw me, he started crying. Not quiet tears, actual sobbing, his shoulders shaking, his breath coming in gasps. "I'm sorry," he choked out. "I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry." I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching this man who'd destroyed my life completely fall apart. Part of me wanted to turn around and leave. Part of me wanted to scream at him to make him feel a fraction of the pain he'd caused. But mostly I just felt tired. I sat down across from him. Didn't say anything. Just waited for him to compose himself enough to speak. It took a few minutes. Brandon wiped his face on his sleeve, took several shuddering breaths, finally looked at me directly. "Thank you for coming. I didn't think you would. I wouldn't have if I were you. Agent Rodriguez said you wanted to explain something." "Everything. I wanted to explain everything. About what happened and why and how I let it get so far out of control." He swallowed hard. "Diane and I were drowning. Financially, emotionally, in every way. I'd lost my job at the marketing firm. We had $85,000 in credit card debt. The house payment was 2 months behind. We were fighting constantly. She wanted me to ask you for help, and I was too proud. I gave you $20,000, I said, when Diane asked. I know, and I spent it paying down the most urgent debts, but it wasn't nearly enough. We still had $65,000 hanging over us. Bill collectors calling every day. Threats of foreclosure. I felt like such a failure, like I couldn't provide for my family, like I was drowning and nobody could see it." He looked down at his cuffed hands. "That's when Webb approached me. At a coffee shop near our house. Said he was a business consultant who'd heard I was having financial difficulties. Asked if I'd be interested in discussing opportunities. I should have known something was wrong. How did he know about our money problems? How did he find me? But I was desperate enough to listen. He met with me 6 times over 4 months, started slow. Asked about my relationship with you, about my access to Davis and Partners accounts, about my marriage to Diane. I thought he was just getting to know me. Then he made his pitch. $500,000 if I would move client funds in a way that would create a scandal. He said the clients would be compensated through insurance, that nobody would really get hurt, that the only victim would be the company itself, which would be acquired by investors who specialized in that sort of thing. And you believed him, I said flatly. I wanted to believe him, because $500,000 would solve all our problems, would let me feel like a provider again instead of a failure, would save my marriage. I convinced myself it wasn't really stealing if the clients got their money back eventually, that I was just moving numbers around on paper, that insurance and legal settlements would make everyone whole. Brandon's voice broke again. But that's not what happened. The clients didn't get compensated. The insurance companies fought the claims. People lost their retirement savings, lost their homes. Some of them lost everything. And your company, your reputation, your whole life got destroyed. All because I was greedy and desperate and stupid. Webb promised you $500,000, I said. How much did you actually get? $250,000. Half up front. He said I'd get the other half after the company collapsed and the investigation concluded. But once you were arrested and charged, he just disappeared. Changed his number. Wouldn't return my calls. I realized he'd played me, used me to destroy your company, and then threw me away like garbage. I looked at Brandon for a long moment, this man who'd been my son-in-law, who'd sat at my Thanksgiving table, who'd been part of my family. Do you know that I almost killed myself? Brandon's face went white. What? December 17th, 2 years ago, 2 in the morning. I was standing on Michigan Avenue Bridge looking down at the water, 71 years old. Everything I'd built destroyed, my reputation gone, my savings gone, my future gone. I was thinking how much easier it would be to just step over that railing. How much simpler if I just wasn't here anymore. Walter, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. The only reason I didn't jump was because Diane sent me a text. A picture of Zoe sleeping in a hospital bed. She'd brought her to work because she couldn't afford a babysitter. The text said, "Dad, I don't know what I'd do without you. You're my rock." And I realized that even though I'd lost everything else, I still mattered to someone. I still had a reason to keep going. Brandon was crying again, harder this time. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. If I'd known, if I'd understood what it would do to you, I never would have done it. I swear I wouldn't. But you did do it. You made that choice. You let Webb manipulate you, yes. But you still chose to forge my signature. You still chose to steal from my clients. You still chose to destroy my company rather than admit to your wife that you needed help. Those were your choices, Brandon, not Webb's. Yours. I know that now. I'll spend the rest of my life knowing that. 3 to 5 years in prison, then the rest of my life living with what I did. But the worst part, the part that keeps me awake at night, isn't what I did to you. It's what I did to Diane. He looked up at me, his face ravaged by guilt. She loved me. She trusted me. She built a life with me, and I destroyed that. I destroyed her marriage, her family, her father's company. I made her question her own judgment. I made her blame herself for my crimes. And I know she's raising Marcus and Zoe alone now because of my choices. I felt something shift in my chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. Here's what you need to know, Brandon. The worst thing you did wasn't stealing the money. It wasn't destroying my company. It was making my daughter feel like she chose wrong, like she should have seen what you were planning, like your crimes were somehow her failure. That's the damage that cuts deepest. That's the wound that's hardest to heal. I know, Brandon whispered. And I don't know how to fix it, how to make her understand that she didn't fail, that she couldn't have known, that I hid it from everyone, including her, because I knew it was wrong. I stood up, preparing to leave. You can't fix it from in here. And maybe you can never fully fix it. But here's what you can do. You can serve your time. You can cooperate with the FBI completely. You can help make sure Webb and anyone else involved in these schemes gets what they deserve. And when you get out, when you've paid your debt, you can be the father Marcus and Zoe deserve. Not because you've earned it, but because they deserve to have a father who shows up, who tries, who doesn't give up. Brandon looked up at me, hope and disbelief mixing on his face. You're saying you'd let me see them after everything. I'm saying it's not about what I'd let. It's about what Diane decides, and what's best for those kids. They didn't ask for any of this. They didn't deserve to have their family torn apart. And if you're willing to do the work, if you're willing to actually change and be better, then maybe you get a chance to be part of their lives again. I walked to the door, then turned back. But understand this, Brandon. You don't get to stop feeling guilty. You don't get redemption just because you apologized. You carry what you did for the rest of your life, and you use that weight to make better choices, to be better. That's the only way forward. When I get out, Brandon said, his voice shaking, can I come see you? Can we talk about how to do that, how to be better? I thought about revenge, about justice, about what I'd learned over the past 6 months about grace and second chances, and refusing to let bitterness define who I became. Yeah, I said, when you get out, come see me. I'll help you figure out how to be the man Diane thought she married, the father your kids need, not because you deserve it, but because they do. I walked toward the door, my hand on the handle, ready to leave this room and this conversation behind. But something made me pause. Maybe it was remembering that bridge. Maybe it was thinking about Marcus and Zoe growing up without a father. Maybe it was just exhaustion with carrying hate around like a weight I couldn't put down. I turned back to face Brandon. How long will you be in prison? Agent Rodriguez's voice came through the intercom. With his cooperation and guilty plea, he's looking at 3 to 5 years. Probably closer to 3 if he continues to assist with other investigations. I nodded, slowly processing. 3 years. Brandon would be 38 when he got out. Still young enough to rebuild. still young enough to be a real father to his kids. Marcus would be 10, Zoe would be 8, still young enough to need a father who showed up. "When you get out," I said, "come see me." Brandon looked up, his eyes red and swollen. "What?" "Come see me when you're released. I'll give you a job. Something in the mailroom or filing, nothing with access to finances. Something that pays enough to support yourself and contribute to your kids. Something that gives you structure and purpose while you figure out who you want to be." Brandon stared at me like I'd spoken in a foreign language. "You would hire me after what I did to you? I'm not doing it for you," I said clearly. "I'm doing it because my daughter deserves to have her children's father be a productive member of society. Because Marcus and Zoe deserve to have a dad who can show up to their soccer games and help with their homework. Because they didn't do anything wrong and they shouldn't suffer for your mistakes for the rest of their lives." I walked back to the table, looked down at this broken man in an orange jumpsuit. "And I'm doing it because I'm 73 years old and I only just figured something out. Revenge doesn't heal anything. Holding on to anger doesn't change what happened. It just poisons you from the inside. I spent 2 years being angry, being bitter, blaming you for destroying my life, and you know what? It got me. A studio apartment and a job pouring coffee. But the moment I let go of that anger, the moment I focused on building something new instead of mourning what was lost, everything changed. I found purpose again. I saved a company. I stopped a criminal who'd been hurting people for over a decade. I became someone my grandkids could be proud of again. Not because I got revenge on you, because I refused to let what you did define who I became." Brandon was crying again, but quietly this time. "I don't deserve this. I don't deserve your forgiveness or your help or anything but your hatred." "You're right, you don't deserve it. But here's what I learned working at that diner serving eggs to people who looked through me like I was invisible. Deserve doesn't matter. Life isn't about getting what you deserve. If it was, I'd still be running my company and you'd never have been desperate enough for Webb to exploit. Life is about choices, about deciding who you want to be and then doing the work to become that person." I leaned forward, making sure he heard every word. "So you're going to serve your time. You're going to help the FBI put away everyone involved in Webb's operation. You're going to take classes, learn skills, become someone who can contribute instead of destroy. And when you get out, you're going to come work for me. Not because you've earned it, not because I've forgiven you, but because my grandchildren deserve better than growing up wondering why their father abandoned them. And because a 73-year-old man finally understands that the only way to heal from someone else's betrayal is to refuse to become bitter yourself. The only way to win is to be better than the people who hurt you. And that means giving second chances even when they're not deserved, especially when they're not deserved." After leaving the FBI office, I drove straight to Diane's house, a small bungalow in Bridgeport, the kind of working-class neighborhood where nurses and teachers and firefighters raised their families. The lawn needed mowing, and one of the shutters hung crooked things that would have been fixed when Brandon lived there. Things Diane didn't have time for now between her double shifts and raising 2 kids alone. I knocked on the door, heard footsteps inside, then Diane's voice calling out, "Just a minute." When she opened the door, I saw that she'd been crying. Her eyes were red and puffy, her face blotchy. She was still in her scrubs from the hospital, her name tag slightly crooked. "Dad," she said, and her voice broke. "Agent Rodriguez called. He told me about Brandon meeting with Webb, about how Brandon was manipulated, about how it was all part of some bigger scheme. He said you went to see Brandon today." I stepped forward and wrapped my arms around her. She collapsed against my chest, sobbing the way she used to when she was a little girl and the world felt too big and scary. I held her, this daughter I'd raised alone after her mother died, this strong woman who'd been through hell because of choices both Brandon and I had made. "Nobody's perfect, sweetheart," I said quietly. "Not Brandon, not me, not you. We all did the best we could with what we knew, and sometimes that's not enough. Sometimes people we trust betray us. Sometimes we miss the warning signs. Sometimes life just kicks us when we're down. But that doesn't mean we failed. It means we're human." Marcus and Zoe came running from the back of the house, their faces lighting up when they saw me. "Grandpa!" they yelled in unison. I knelt down my knees, protesting, but my heart full, and gathered them both into my arms. Marcus smelled like grass and sunshine. Zoe had paint on her hands from some art project. They were beautiful and innocent, and deserved so much better than the chaos the adults in their lives had created. "Do you guys want to hear a story?" I asked. "Yes." Zoe bounced excitedly. About what? About how the oldest man in the room taught a billionaire a thing or two. About how being knocked down isn't the same as being knocked out. About how sometimes you have to lose everything to figure out what really matters. Marcus looked up at me with those serious eyes that were so much like his mother's. Is this a story about you, Grandpa? Yeah, buddy, it's about me and your mom and even your dad. It's about how we all made mistakes, how some people tried to hurt us, but how we didn't let them win, how we chose to be better instead of bitter, how we chose family over anger. Diane sat down beside us, wiping her eyes. Tell us, Dad. Tell us the whole story. I think we all need to hear it. So I told them. Not all the details, not the parts that were too dark for young ears, but the important parts about falling and getting back up, about finding dignity in unexpected places, about how the measure of a person isn't where they start or even where they fall, but whether they choose to rise again. 6 months later, on a crisp November morning, Richard and I stood in front of a brand new office building in the South Loop. The neighborhood was changing, old warehouses being converted to lofts, new restaurants opening, young families moving in. The kind of place where something new could grow. The sign above the door read Davis and Blackstone Strategic Consulting in letters that caught the morning sun. Our company, built not on ego or greed or the desire to dominate, but on the simple belief that expertise and integrity still mattered. That second chances were possible. That building something good was more important than building something big. We'd designed the office space ourselves, 15,000 square feet across 2 floors, conference rooms with glass walls, an open floor plan that encouraged collaboration, a break room with a real espresso machine, and a hiring policy that prioritized diversity. 40% of our staff were people of color, 30% were over 50. 20% were what we called second chance hires, people rebuilding careers after setbacks. We specialized in helping businesses that traditional consultants overlooked. Minority-owned firms, family businesses in transition, companies recovering from setbacks, the kinds of clients who needed expertise but couldn't afford the big-name firms, the kinds of stories we understood because we'd lived them. Richard stood at the microphone we'd set up for the opening ceremony, addressing the small crowd of employees, clients, and supporters. 2 years ago, I was on the verge of losing everything I'd built. I was making terrible decisions, chasing ego instead of wisdom, surrounding myself with yes men instead of truth tellers. Then I walked into a diner and met a 71-year-old waiter who changed my life. He gestured to me. Walter taught me that wisdom doesn't have an age limit, that dignity doesn't have a price tag, that expertise doesn't disappear just because someone tries to destroy it. He taught me that the color of a man's skin or the uniform he wears or where he's fallen from matters less than what he knows and who he chooses to be. Then it was my turn. I stepped to the microphone, looking out at the faces gathered there. Some I knew well, some I was just getting to know. All of them representing something I'd thought I'd lost forever. Purpose, community, the ability to contribute something meaningful to the world. I've learned a few things over the past 2 years, I began. I learned that it's never too late to start over. That rock bottom can be a foundation if you choose to build on it. That losing everything can teach you what actually matters. And I learned that forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about refusing to let someone else's actions poison who you become. The weeks after the opening became a blur of activity, of building something new while honoring what had been lost. I visited Murphy's Diner on a Tuesday morning. Tommy was behind the counter, like always, coffee pot in hand, stained apron tied around his waist. When he saw me, his face broke into a genuine smile. "Walter heard about your fancy new consulting firm. Too good for us now." I shook his hand, this man who'd given me work when nobody else would. Never too good for the place that kept me going when I had nothing else. Thank you, Tommy, for seeing past the scandal, for giving me a chance when the rest of the world had written me off. You earned it. Best damn waiter I ever had, even if you were overqualified. And Blackstone Enterprises continued its recovery. By year's end, revenue was up 340% from my first day. The company had gone from the edge of bankruptcy to being featured in business journals as a turnaround success story. Richard was being invited to speak at conferences, sharing the lessons we'd learned about humility and adaptation and the courage to admit mistakes. Leonard Webb was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. The judge cited the systematic nature of his crimes, the multiple victims, the devastating impact on families and communities. 7 other co-conspirators were also charged, their network of corporate sabotage finally exposed. Brandon served his time at a minimum security federal facility. He completed every educational program offered, took accounting and business ethics classes, participated in counseling. Diane visited him monthly, bringing the kids 3 times. Not reconciliation, but beginning the long process of forgiveness. Agent Rodriguez received a commendation for the investigation, his work exposing one of the most sophisticated corporate fraud schemes in recent Chicago history. And I turned 73 feeling younger than I had at 71, feeling like life was just beginning instead of ending. Our new office occupied the 15th floor of the South Loop building. Not the top floor, not the most expensive view, but windows that looked out over the neighborhood where I'd grown up. The south side of Chicago, where my parents had raised me, where I'd learned about work and dignity and perseverance, coming full circle. Richard and I sat at the conference table reviewing applications from potential clients. He picked up one folder, studied it for a moment, then passed it to me. Single mother, 32 years old, 3 kids, started a food truck business last year. Applied for a bank loan to expand to a second truck but got rejected because her credit score is below 600. Late payments during her divorce, medical bills from when her youngest had pneumonia. The numbers say she's a risk. I opened the folder, scanned the financial statements, saw past the credit score to the story underneath. Revenue consistent and growing. Customer reviews excellent. Business plan detailed and realistic. A woman working 18-hour days to build something for her family, rejected by traditional lenders because numbers on paper couldn't capture determination and work ethic. Credit scores don't tell the whole story, I said, closing the folder. Set up a meeting. Let's talk to her. Richard smiled. That's why we're partners. We shook hands across the table, 2 men from different worlds who'd found common ground in the wreckage of their separate disasters, building something that mattered, helping people who deserved a chance. Proving that expertise and integrity still counted for something in a world that often valued neither. The phone rang. Another potential client, another story, another opportunity to use what we'd learned from falling to help someone else rise, and I answered it. At 73, I learned more about life than I did in my previous 71 years. I learned that rock bottom isn't the end. It's often the foundation for something stronger. I learned that grace isn't about forgetting what someone did to you. It's about refusing to let their actions define who you become. They say success is the best revenge. I disagree. The best revenge is becoming the person who no longer needs revenge. It's looking at the man who destroyed you and offering him a chance at redemption, not because he earned it, but because you're finally free enough to give it. I learned that a $47 bank account and a waiter job at 71 years old isn't failure. It's preparation. Every plate I served, every insult I swallowed every morning, I woke up when I wanted to give up. Those were the moments that rebuilt my character from the ground up. Most importantly, I learned that dignity isn't something people give you. It's something you carry whether you're managing $50 million or pouring coffee, whether you're in a corner office or a diner booth, whether the person across from you respects you or not. Because at the end of the day, the measure of a man isn't what he achieves at his peak. It's what he does when he's knocked down to his lowest, and whether he uses that experience to lift others up or to stay bitter. I chose to lift, and that choice saved more than just a company. It saved my soul. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from defeating your enemies, but from refusing to become like them. Not from getting revenge, but from building something so good that revenge becomes irrelevant. Not from holding on to anger, but from choosing grace even when it's not deserved. That's the lesson it took me 73 years to learn. And it was worth every hard moment it took to get there. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt knocked down by life and wondered if you could get back up, leave a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from and share your own story of resilience. Hit that subscribe button if you believe it's never too late to start over. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that their past doesn't define their future. And remember, whether you're in the corner office or serving coffee, your dignity is yours to keep. Nobody can take it unless you let them. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next story.